Thousands of years ago, someone built something that should not exist. The stones are too heavy, the alignments too perfect, the knowledge too advanced. Every official answer raises more questions than it solves. So what are they not telling us? A forbidden chronicle of eternity. Genesis, the secret origin of mankind. Before the first star was named, before the first ocean learned its shore, something ancient moved through the dark. Something that remembered. Something that decided to make us. Before the before. In the age before time had a name, there was no darkness. Darkness requires space to exist in, and space had not yet been dreamed. There was no silence. Silence requires the memory of sound. There was simply nothing. And then, like a thought occurring to a mind so vast it could not know it was thinking, something stirred. Picture it not as an explosion. Every textbook, every documentary, every simulation on a classroom screen shows the beginning as a violent rupture, a fireball of matter and energy screaming outward from a single impossible point. But the truth, if we dare approach it, is stranger than fire. The truth is that the universe did not explode into existence. It exhaled. Something, call it what you will, the first mind, the original architect, the dreamer beyond time, breathed out. And in that exhalation, everything that would ever exist was already encoded. The shape of every galaxy, the orbit of every world, the exact chemical composition of every ocean that would ever form on every planet in every spiral arm of every cosmic structure, it was all there, folded into that first impossible breath, like a library folded into a single word. We call what followed the Big Bang because we needed something to call it. We needed the word bang because our brains respond to percussion, to sudden violent events that we can place on a timeline. But there was no bang. There was the first heartbeat of something immeasurably, incomprehensibly old, something that had always been, that existed outside of time, the way the ocean exists outside the individual wave. The universe was not created. The universe was remembered. The universe was not created. The universe was remembered, recalled into existence by something that had dreamed it before time began. For billions of years, a number so large it becomes meaningless to human perception, the young universe did what newborns do. It grew without purpose. Stars ignited and died in silence, their deaths seeding the void with heavier elements, building the chemical vocabulary that life would one day need to speak itself into being. Hydrogen became helium, helium became carbon, carbon became oxygen. In the hearts of dying stars, iron was forged, gold was forged. Every atom more complex than hydrogen was hammered out in stellar furnaces and flung across the void in explosions of staggering beauty. Consider what it means that we are made of star stuff, not metaphorically, literally. The iron in your blood was fused in the death throes of a star that died before our sun was born. The calcium in your bones was manufactured in stellar cores and scattered by supernovae. The carbon that forms the backbone of every molecule in your body was cooked in stellar furnaces a billion years before Earth existed. You are, in the most literal sense possible, the universe experiencing itself, a collection of ancient stellar material that learned to look up at the night sky and wonder where it came from. But here is where we must depart from the textbook. Here is where the mystery begins. Because among the billions of galaxies that formed in those early eons, one particular spiral galaxy cohered in a particular way, and within it, an unremarkable yellow star in an unremarkable outer arm ignited. And around that star, a blue world formed. And on that world, something happened that was not random. Something happened that had been planned, perhaps since before the first exhale. The lonely arithmetic. Astronomers have calculated that the universe contains approximately 2 trillion galaxies. Within each galaxy, there are hundreds of billions to trillions of stars. Around those stars, uncounted worlds orbit in various configurations of distance, composition, and size. The numbers are so large they lose meaning. Every grain of sand on every beach of Earth represents thousands of entire worlds. And yet, for all that inconceivable vastness, we have found no other voice. We have pointed our instruments at the sky for a century, listening with radio telescopes of enormous sensitivity, scanning billions of frequencies for any pattern, any repetition, any signal that mathematics has been discovered on another world. Silence. We have sent our own signals out into the dark, the Pioneer plaque, the Voyager golden record, the Arecibo message, and nothing has answered. The universe is, to all appearances, empty of anyone who cares to talk. This is called the Fermi paradox, and it is one of the most disturbing questions in all of science. If the universe is so old, so vast, and so apparently rich in conditions favorable to life, then where is everyone? Why aren't the skies thick with the signals of ancient civilizations? Why have we found no artifacts, no megastructures, no rearranged star systems, no Dyson spheres drinking the light of distant suns? The standard answers range from the sobering to the terrifying. Perhaps life is far rarer than we think, and we are genuinely alone. Perhaps civilizations inevitably destroy themselves before they reach the stars. Perhaps someone is out there, but has chosen not to speak to us, or is forbidden from speaking to us. Perhaps the silence is not absence, but something far more intentional. Sumerian Tablet, Enuma Elish, Fragment 3. In the beginning, when the sky above was not yet named, and the earth beneath had not yet been called by any name, the primordial Apsu, their father, and Tiamat, she who bore them all, were mingling their waters together. No reed hut had been constructed, no marshland appeared. When no gods whatever had been brought into being, uncalled by name, their destinies undetermined, then it was that the gods were formed within them. What the Sumerians knew, what every ancient civilization preserved in its creation myths, its sacred texts, its temple carvings, was that the beginning was not empty. Something was already there, something with intention, something with a plan. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki, those who from heaven came. The Egyptians called them the Neteru, the divine principles behind all things. The Vedic texts called them the Devas, the shining ones. The Book of Enoch called them the Watchers. Every culture across every continent, separated by oceans and millennia, told the same story. Before humans, there were others. They came from the sky. They shaped us. They left, and they will return. Is this mythology? Is it the universal human tendency to anthropomorphize the cosmos, to populate the dark with faces and intentions? Perhaps. But consider the alternative. Consider what it would mean if the stories are not metaphors, but memories. Consider what it means that the oldest written records of our species do not begin with, "and humans lived upon the earth," but instead begin with, "and the gods descended from the heavens, and they made humans to serve them." Consider that we are asking the wrong question. We ask, is there intelligent life out there? But the texts, the stones, the myths, the sacred architectures of every ancient civilization on Earth all whisper a more unsettling answer. They were already here. Before we go further, we must establish something important about the nature of this chronicle. What follows is not a work of science fiction, though it draws on the same primal yearning that makes great science fiction great, the yearning to know where we truly come from. What follows is not religious scripture, though it stands in dialogue with every religious tradition that has ever tried to answer the same questions. What follows is a synthesis, built from the oldest human records, from modern discoveries in genetics and archaeology and physics and cosmology, and from the terrifying possibility that all of these threads, when pulled together, tell a single coherent story. The story of our making, the story that was hidden from us, the story we were never meant to remember, but somehow, in the marrow of our oldest myths, never quite forgot. The engineers of heaven. Those who preceded the first sunrise. They did not arise from nothing either. That is the first thing to understand about the beings who would eventually create us. They too had a history. They too had suffered, struggled, loved, warred, and wondered. The architects of humanity were themselves the product of an older creation, and they carried with them the weight of that older story in everything they did to us. Call them the engineers. Not because that word captures their full nature. It does not, any more than the word father captures the full relationship between a parent and a child, but because it describes the essential nature of their relationship to the cosmos. They were beings who had mastered the manipulation of matter at its most fundamental level. Where we use tools to reshape the surface of things, they used consciousness to reshape the structure of things. Where we build with hands, they built with intention. Where we alter environments to suit ourselves, they altered the very code that determines what life can be. They were old. When our sun was young and hot, and the earth was a ball of cooling magma, they had already been civilized for eons. When the first amino acids pooled in the first warm ocean of the young earth and stumbled toward self-replication in the ancient chemical soup, they had already mapped the stars of 1,000 worlds. When the first single-celled organisms divided and divided in the darkness beneath the primitive sea, their civilization had already risen, collapsed, and been rebuilt more than once. What did they look like? Every culture that encountered them recorded different features, different faces, different configurations of form. The ancient Mesopotamians depicted them as tall, powerfully built humanoids, wearing what appear to be wristwatches and carrying what look like handbags, a detail so specific and so strange that it appears in carvings from multiple unconnected civilizations. The Egyptians showed them with animal heads, the head of a jackal, the head of a hawk, the head of an ibis, which may have been symbolic or may have been a literal attempt to capture the alienness of beings whose faces did not entirely conform to the human template. Fragment from the Lost Book of Thoth. They came before the stars had numbers. Their skin held the light of places beyond the rim of sky. When they spoke, the stones remembered. When they were silent, even the void paid attention. They were not gods in the manner of worship. They were gods in the manner of knowledge, beings who had walked the long road of learning until learning became creation. The Vedic texts of ancient India are perhaps the most detailed. They describe the Devas, often translated as gods, but literally meaning the shining ones, as beings of extraordinary longevity, capable of traveling between worlds, equipped with flying vehicles called vimanas that could move at incomprehensible speeds, and possessing weapons of such terrible power that the texts compare their detonations to the destruction of entire armies in a single flash of light and heat. Scholars long dismissed these descriptions as poetic exaggeration. Then we invented nuclear weapons, and suddenly the Vedic descriptions of the blazing fire of 1,000 suns and the hair of survivors falling out began to read less like poetry and more like technical documentation. The engineers, whoever they were, whatever we choose to call them, were not gods in the theological sense. They did not create the universe. They did not exist outside of time. They were subject to physics, constrained by biology, or whatever biology means for a being millions of years more evolved than us, limited by mortality in some fashion, however different that mortality was from ours. They could die. They did die. Their civilizations could fall, and, the records suggest, more than once they did. Their biology, their technology. Here is a truth that modern genetics has stumbled upon without quite knowing what to do with. Human DNA contains sequences that have no obvious origin in evolutionary history. Not merely sequences that are mysterious or whose function is not yet understood, all biology contains those. Rather, sequences that appear to have been inserted. Sequences that geneticists, when they find them, describe using the word junk, because they don't code for anything they can identify, because they appear inert, because the simplest explanation for their presence is that they are evolutionary leftovers. But there are an awful lot of them, and some of them are extraordinarily precise, organized in ways that look less like the random accumulation of evolutionary history and more like deliberate programming. Francis Crick, co-discoverer of the DNA double helix, one of the 2 or 3 greatest scientific discoveries in human history, spent the later part of his career advocating for a theory he called directed panspermia. The idea is exactly what it sounds like, that life on Earth was not an accident of chemistry, but was deliberately seeded here by an ancient extraterrestrial civilization. Crick came to this conclusion not from mysticism or wishful thinking, but from the mathematics of probability. The spontaneous generation of a self-replicating molecule capable of evolution, the simplest possible living thing, is so vanishingly unlikely under natural conditions that Crick calculated it essentially could not have happened in the time available. Something had to help. But directed panspermia, as Crick framed it, imagines only the sending of simple organic molecules across space, primitive bacterial spores, perhaps, riding comets or directed by spacecraft. That is the modest version. The immodest version, the version the myths have always insisted on, is that the seeding was not of simple life, but of specifically human life. That someone did not merely plant the first microbe in the primordial ocean and walk away, that someone came back, repeatedly, over millions of years, guiding the experiment, adjusting the variables, and at a certain critical moment, intervening directly. They did not create us from nothing. They created us from themselves, poured a fragment of their ancient fire into the raw clay of an ape, and watched to see if it would burn. The engineers, if such beings existed, would have had a biological toolkit that makes our most advanced genetic engineering look like finger painting. They would have understood the genome not as a code to be slowly read and tentatively edited, but as a language they were fluent in, capable of writing new organisms the way a master composer writes a symphony, with intention in every note, with meaning in every silence, with the whole structure designed to produce a specific emotional and functional outcome. They would have seeded worlds the way a gardener seeds a field. They would have walked among the results, studying them, selecting for certain traits, pruning others. They would have known that life, given enough time and the right initial conditions, would evolve toward complexity, toward nervous systems, toward brains, toward something approaching consciousness. And they would have had, over the billions of years of their civilization, the opportunity to watch this process play out on thousands of worlds, to develop a deep understanding of the shape that intelligent life tends to take. Perhaps that is why the myths insist, across every culture, that the gods looked like us. Not because humans are the center of the universe, but because the engineers had discovered something fundamental, that a certain body plan, bilateral symmetry, upright locomotion, opposable thumbs, large frontal cortex was a convergent solution, arrived at independently on world after world, because it is simply the most effective configuration for a being that uses tools and language. They had seen it many times before, and when they made us in the image they had grown comfortable with, in the image of themselves. The question of their motivation. This is the hardest question. Not did they exist, but why did they make us? Because the answer to that question determines everything that follows, determines whether our creation was an act of love or an act of utility, whether we were made as children or as tools, whether we were meant to grow into something equal to our makers or to forever serve them in the long shadow of their superiority. The Sumerian texts are blunt about this. The Anunnaki, the texts say, created humans because they needed workers. The gods themselves had been laboring in the mines of the earth, extracting gold and other precious materials, and they were tired. They demanded relief from their toil, and so their chief scientist, Enki in the Sumerian account, the god of wisdom and the deep waters, was tasked with creating a being who could do the labor the gods no longer wished to do. The Lulu Amelu, the mixed worker, was the result, a being made from the clay of the earth, the existing hominid species already present on the planet, modified with the essence of the gods, their genetic material, to produce something capable enough to work, intelligent enough to follow instructions, but not intelligent enough, or so the plan went, to ask too many questions. This is a profoundly disturbing account if taken literally. It means we were not made from love, we were made from convenience. We were a labor-saving device, organic machinery designed to do the work that more advanced beings found beneath their dignity. The creation of humanity, on this account, was not a sacred act, but an industrial one. We were manufactured. And yet, and this is the thread that runs through every subsequent chapter of this chronicle, we were more than they expected. Something in the mixing, something in the combining of their ancient genetic material with the biological potential of the Earth's most advanced primate produced an outcome that exceeded the specification. The machine, as it were, woke up. And that waking, that terrifying, unexpected emergence of self-awareness, of curiosity, of desire, of the capacity to love and dream and ask forbidden questions, changed everything between the makers and the made. The seed bearers, how life was carried across the void. Before the first cell divided on Earth, someone had already been here. The evidence is in the rocks, in structures and patterns and chemical signatures that orthodox science explains correctly but incompletely through the mechanisms of chemistry and geology. The full story requires something more. It requires us to consider the possibility that what we call natural processes were, at least in one critical case, assisted. The earliest microfossils found on Earth date to approximately 3.5 billion years ago, a mere billion years after the planet cooled enough to have liquid water on its surface. In geological terms, this is astonishingly fast. the conditions required for life to arise spontaneously, stable chemistry, appropriate temperature, sufficient complexity of organic molecules, reliable energy sources, are difficult to achieve and difficult to maintain. They require fine-tuning that strains credibility when we consider how many variables had to align. And yet, life appeared with what, in geological terms, can only be called unseemly haste. More perplexing, when that early life appeared, it was not simple in the way that random chemical self-organization might produce. The machinery of even the most primitive cell is staggeringly complex, a molecular factory of interlocking systems, each dependent on the others, each requiring the others to exist before it can come into being. The RNA world hypothesis, the most credible scientific explanation for the origin of life, posits that self-replicating RNA molecules preceded both DNA and proteins and served as the first information storage and catalytic molecules in the first cells. This is plausible, but the leap from self-replicating RNA to anything resembling a cell, with its lipid membranes, its molecular motors, its energy harvesting mechanisms, its genetic code, remains one of the great unsolved problems in all of biology.
The Rig Veda, Hymn of Creation, Nasadea Sukta. There was neither non-existence nor existence then, neither the realm of space nor the sky which is beyond. What stirred? Where? In whose protection? Was there water unfathomably deep? There was neither death nor immortality then. There was no distinguishing sign of night or day. That one breathed, windless, by its own impulse. Other than that, there was nothing beyond. Who really knows? Who will here proclaim it? Whence was it produced? Whence is this creation? The gods came afterwards with the creation of this universe. Who then knows whence it has arisen? The Vedic sages 3,000 years ago were asking exactly the right questions. The gods came afterwards. Even the ancient hymns knew that the gods did not precede creation, but arrived within it, as part of it, as beings who themselves emerged from the mystery. This is crucial. The engineers were not omnipotent creators who existed outside the universe they shaped. They were beings of the universe, older, wiser, more powerful, but still subject to its laws, still constrained by its physics, still mortal in some ultimate sense. They were gardeners, not gods. And what they planted on Earth was not random. Consider the concept of panspermia, the hypothesis that life can travel between star systems, carried in the frozen hearts of comets or on the ejecta of asteroid impacts. This is no longer a fringe idea. We have found amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, in meteorites. We have found microbial spores that can survive in vacuum and radiation for extraordinarily long periods. We know that material ejected from one world can, over millions of years, travel to another. The mathematics of panspermia work. Life can hitch rides across space. But natural panspermia is slow, random, and dependent on extraordinary coincidences of planetary alignment and impact timing. Directed panspermia, panspermia conducted by a civilization with the knowledge and technology to aim it, would be precise, efficient, and far more likely to produce results. If you wanted to seed a world with life, if you had the technology to do so, you would not rely on the chance that a comet might carry the right chemistry to the right planet at the right time. You would go there. You would assess the conditions, you would design the initial payload carefully, and you would return to check on your work.
The cargo. What was in the payload? This question has a scientific answer and a mythological one,
and the two are more similar than the scientists would care to admit. The scientific answer, the most efficient seeding, would involve not raw chemistry, but something more organized, perhaps an engineered RNA system capable of establishing itself in the early Earth's warm chemistry, perhaps a set of synthetic genetic instructions designed to survive and self-replicate under the specific conditions known to exist on the young Earth. Not life in the full sense, but the blueprint for life, the seed of a seed. The mythological answer, preserved in the traditions of cultures from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, is more vivid and more specific. The beings who came brought the essences of life, described in different traditions as divine water, sacred fire, the blood of heaven, the word of power. The Sumerians described Enki pouring the divine formula, the Mi, into the waters of the Abzu, the deep underground freshwater ocean from which all life emerged. The Egyptian text described Ptah, the craftsman god, creating life through the word, literally through organized sound and intention, which maps interestingly onto our modern understanding that DNA is, at its core, a language, a code, an organized sequence of information. The Mayan Popol Vuh describes the creator gods speaking the world into existence. It is well that there should be your glory on the earth, you who are invoked, you who are prayed to. Come out and breathe. In each of these accounts, life is created through a kind of intentional information transfer, a blueprint imposed on raw matter, a pattern given to chaos, a code written into the substrate of the world. This is not bad mythology. This is, in metaphorical dress, a description of genetic engineering. Every myth that says the gods breathed life into clay is telling you, in the language available to it, that someone rewrote the genetic code of an existing biological substrate and watched it wake up. The seed bearers came to Earth at a time we cannot precisely determine, because the evidence has been obscured by billions of years of geological transformation, because the records they may have left are buried beyond our reach, because the life forms they initially seeded would be indistinguishable to our instruments from life that arose naturally. They did not announce themselves with monuments or inscriptions at this earliest stage. They were not, at this point, interested in being remembered. They were gardeners. They came, they planted, they left, and they waited. The waiting would take a very long time, approximately 2.5 billion years if the timeline we can reconstruct from the fossil record is accurate. For 2.5 billion years, the planted seed grew, from single-celled organisms to multicellular life, from multicellular life to the Cambrian explosion, from the Cambrian to fish and amphibians and reptiles and dinosaurs. The garden developed its own complex ecology, its own evolutionary dynamics, its own path toward complexity. The gardeners presumably were elsewhere during this time, tending other gardens, managing the affairs of their civilization, watching from instruments far away. But they watched. They always watched. Because the experiment on Earth was special. Because Earth, with its extraordinary moon, so large it is really a double planet, producing tidal dynamics that accelerated the development of complex chemistry in coastal zones, its position in the habitable zone, its magnetic field, its geological dynamism, Earth was the garden that had the most promise. And when the mammals appeared, and among the mammals the primates, and among the primates a lineage with particular cognitive potential, the gardeners prepared to return. The planetary archive. There is a structure in the mathematics of our solar system that is difficult to explain by chance alone. The planets are arranged in orbits that conform to a specific numerical series, Bode's law, with an uncanny precision that astronomers have never satisfactorily explained.
The moon's distance from the Earth is such that during a solar eclipse, it appears almost exactly the same size as the sun, a coincidence so precise that the chance of it occurring naturally is vanishingly small. The tilt of Earth's axis, which produces the seasons and profoundly shapes the conditions for life, is stabilized by the gravitational influence of the moon in a way that would not be possible if the moon were either much smaller or in a different orbital position. Are these coincidences? Almost certainly, the orthodox scientific answer is yes. The appearance of fine-tuning is an artifact of our tendency to notice patterns that seem meaningful. But there is another answer. There is the possibility that the solar system we inhabit was, at some point in its history, modified, that the moon's orbit was adjusted, that certain planetary positions were tuned, that the cosmic machinery within which life on Earth evolved was, in some critical ways, engineered to produce the outcome it produced. This is not a comfortable thought. It implies a level of power and knowledge so far beyond our own that comparison becomes meaningless. But we should remember, we are a species that in a mere 10,000 years of civilization has gone from flint tools to nuclear power and genetic engineering. The engineers had millions of years, perhaps hundreds of millions. What they could do to a solar system with that much time and that much knowledge is not something we can easily constrain with our imagination. The failure to imagine it is our limitation, not evidence of its impossibility. Earth before memory, the long dream of a world still becoming. Earth was 4.5 billion years old when the first being that might generously be called our ancestor stood upright. And in the 10 million years before we became fully human, the world around those proto-ancestors was already ancient beyond imagination, layered with history, haunted by extinctions, shaped by catastrophes so immense they make human history look like a brief paragraph in an endless book. Walk back through the deep archive of this world. Go back 66 million years to the dark moment when a 12-kilometer asteroid smashed into the shallow waters of what is now Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula and ended the age of dinosaurs. The impact released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear bombs. It threw dust and debris into the stratosphere that blocked sunlight for years. The world froze. 3/4 of all species on Earth died. And in the darkness and cold that followed, in the smoking ruins of the Cretaceous, small, frightened, nocturnal mammals clung to the edges of a devastated world and waited. Those mammals were our great-grandparents, 10 million generations removed. They were no larger than rats. They were warm-blooded, which gave them an advantage in the sudden cold. They were smart enough, for their size, to adapt quickly. And as the long winter of the extinction event slowly yielded to a warming world, as the ferns crept back across the bare earth and the forests began to rebuild themselves, those survivors diversified with extraordinary speed. In 10 million years, the blink of an eye in geological terms, they had produced elephants, whales, bats, horses, and the lineage of small-brained tree dwellers who would, in another 50 million years, become the primates. The primates. Here is where the story begins to feel intentional. Among all the mammalian lineages that diversified after the extinction event, the primates developed a specific cluster of adaptations that no other group did. Forward-facing eyes for depth perception, grasping hands with opposable thumbs, brains disproportionately large for their body size, an extended period of childhood dependence that created conditions for learning and social bonding, and a social structure built around long-term pair bonds and family groups. These adaptations, taken together, point in one direction, toward a species that uses tools, that communicates in complex ways, that learns from its elders, that accumulates and transmits knowledge across generations. The primates were, in other words, building towards something.
Whether that trajectory was random, the blind working of natural selection on variation, or directed, the slow shaping of a lineage toward a predetermined destination, is the central question. And the answer, as we will see, may be both. The 6 million year gap. 6 million years ago, the lineage that would become us diverged from the lineage that would become chimpanzees. This is the most extraordinary genetic fact in the history of life on Earth, that our closest living relatives, the beings who share 98.7% of our DNA, are not us. That between us and the chimps lies a gulf that cannot be measured in DNA alone, a gulf of consciousness, of culture, of language, of art, of mathematics, of philosophy, of war, of love in the full human sense, of the capacity to look at the stars and ask what they mean. 98.7% shared DNA, and yet the difference is absolute. A chimpanzee is an intelligent, social, tool-using animal, but it does not build cities. It does not write poetry. It does not develop religions, empires, or nuclear physics. In the 1.3% of genetic difference between us lies everything that makes us what we are, and evolutionary theory, as presently formulated, has genuine difficulty explaining how that difference arose, when it arose, and why it arose so quickly. Sumerian tablets, the Atrahasis epic. When the gods, like men, bore the work and suffered the toil of the gods was great, the work of the gods was heavy, the distress was much. They dug up the Tigris riverbed and then dug up the Euphrates. For 10 years they carried the workload, for 20 years they suffered the toil. They called the goddess Ninmah, the midwife of the gods. Enki spoke to her, "I will release from the yoke what belongs to you. Fashion a human, let it bear the yoke. Let it bear the yoke assigned by Enlil. Let a human carry the toil of the gods." The Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest written texts in human history, is not vague about what happened. The gods were working. The work was too hard. A decision was made to create a substitute worker, a being who would bear the burden so the gods could rest. And the method described is unmistakably genetic. The essence of a god, blood, divine clay, the divine formula, was mixed with the clay of the earth, the existing hominid genome, to produce a new type of being. This is the Sumerian story of our creation. It is at least 4,000 years old in written form, and in oral tradition far older. It precedes every other creation account we know of, and its extraordinary specificity, the naming of specific engineering figures, the description of specific procedures, the framing of the creation as a practical, utilitarian act rather than a mystical one, sets it apart from the creation myths of cultures that came later and seem to have borrowed from it. The Genesis account in Genesis, for example, is a simplified and theologized version of the Atrahasis epic and the Enuma Elish. Biblical scholars have acknowledged this for over a century. The Hebrews, during their Babylonian captivity, absorbed and adapted Mesopotamian myths that were themselves much older. The Babylonians had inherited them from the Sumerians, who had inherited them from whoever came before the Sumerians, that mysterious pre-literate culture that built the world's first cities with what appears to be a fully formed knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, law, and governance, as if they had not developed gradually through cultural evolution, but had received their knowledge as a complete package from somewhere else. The oldest human records do not begin with humans. They begin with the beings who made us, and the instructions those beings gave us for how to be what they had decided we should become. In the earth before memory, before writing, before civilization, before the archaeological record becomes legible to us, there were hominids.
For millions of years, they were successful in the evolutionary sense. They survived, they adapted, they spread across Africa and into Asia and Europe. They made crude tools, they discovered fire, they buried their dead. But they did not build, they did not write, they did not stare at the stars and make systematic records of their movements. They were intelligent animals, but they were not, by any reasonable definition of the word, civilized. And then, with a swiftness that the archaeological record captures as an almost vertical line on the chart of cultural development, everything changed. Not gradually, not through the slow accumulation of small improvements over many generations, suddenly, as if a switch had been thrown, as if something had happened to the clay. The first experiment. When the clay was first taken up and shaped in the laboratories of heaven, if we are to use the language of the texts, the first attempt to create a new being was not a success. The records hint at this: failed creatures, abominations, things that were neither fully animal nor fully divine, experiments that went wrong in ways the engineers had not anticipated. The first experiment always fails. That is the nature of creation. Understand what the engineers were attempting. They were not starting from nothing. The Earth already had an extraordinary diversity of animal life, and among that life there was already a lineage, the genus Homo, that had developed far beyond the cognitive capabilities of any other species on the planet. Homo habilis, Homo erectus, the various branches of the hominid tree that had been growing for millions of years, these were the raw material. Not clay in the poetic sense, but in the practical sense, biological substrates with existing cognitive architecture that could be modified. The decision to use an existing species as the starting point was practical. Building intelligence from scratch is far harder than upgrading existing intelligence. The hominid brain already had the basic architecture: a large neocortex, specialized regions for language processing, complex social cognition, the capacity for tool use. These were features that had developed over millions of years of natural selection and could not easily be replicated in a laboratory. Better to start with what evolution already built and add the modifications that natural evolution, left to its own devices, would never produce, or would produce only after millions more years of blind selection. But the modifications required were not trivial. The genetic distance between what existed, Homo erectus, or a close relative, and what was desired, a being capable of complex language, abstract thought, long-term planning, and the kind of cultural accumulation that allows knowledge to compound across generations, was enormous. Not in terms of the number of gene changes required, perhaps, but in terms of the interactions and cascading effects of those changes, the unpredictable ways that altering developmental genes would reshape the biology of the entire organism. The chromosome question. Here is one of the most extraordinary facts in all of genetics. Humans have 46 chromosomes, organized in 23 pairs. Every other great ape, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, has 48 chromosomes, organized in 24 pairs. This is not a trivial difference. Chromosome number is one of the most fundamental aspects of a species' biology. It determines how chromosomes pair during reproduction and is usually a major barrier to interbreeding between species. A different chromosome count typically means reproductive isolation. The organisms with different counts cannot produce viable offspring together. And yet, here we are, with 46 chromosomes where our closest relatives have 48. How did we lose a pair? The answer that geneticists have settled on is chromosome fusion. Two ancestral chromosomes that were separate in our ape ancestors somehow merged into a single chromosome early in human evolutionary history. Our chromosome 2, the second largest chromosome in the human genome, shows clear evidence of being a fusion of two ancestral ape chromosomes. You can see the traces of the original chromosome endings, telomeric sequences, in the middle of chromosome 2, where the fusion occurred, as well as the remnant of a second centromere, the attachment point for cell division machinery, that is no longer functional. This fusion happened. Genetically, it is not disputed. What is disputed is how it happened. The standard explanation is that a random fusion event occurred in a single individual and spread through the population because it happened to confer some reproductive advantage, or at minimum, no disadvantage. This is possible. Such events do occasionally happen in nature, but they are rare, and when they do happen in a natural population, the individual carrying the fusion chromosome is at a reproductive disadvantage when breeding with the majority of the population who still carry the unfused chromosomes. Spreading such a fusion through a natural population is not straightforward. An alternative explanation, one that no mainstream scientist would currently publish without risking their career, is that the fusion was not random, that it was intentional. That someone who understood chromosome biology very well decided that reducing the chromosome count by one pair would produce specific changes in the resulting organism and made it happen.
From the laboratory of Enki, as remembered, 14 birth goddesses were assembled. 7 he called to his right, 7 to his left. Between them he placed the clay of the Abzu, already shaped, already breathing with the old breath. Into the clay he pressed the divine formula. Into the clay he pressed the image. When the divine formula touched the living clay, the clay wept. The clay remembered something it had never known. The first one that was made wept for 7 days. On the 8th day it stood upright and spoke. Enki heard the speaking and was afraid. He had made something that could be afraid. The first experiment was Homo heidelbergensis, or something like it, a being that was physically powerful, cognitively capable by primate standards, capable of making complex tools and using fire, capable perhaps of some form of proto-language, but not yet fully what the engineers wanted. Not yet capable of the kind of abstract symbolic thought that would allow it to accumulate culture, to develop art and religion and mathematics, to eventually, and this is the critical capability, to record and transmit knowledge in a form that would persist beyond the individual lifetime and the lifetime of the generations who received it orally. The first experiment walked the earth for hundreds of thousands of years. It was successful enough to survive, to spread, to develop regional variants across Africa, Europe, and Asia. Its descendants became Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, and various other hominid populations whose bones we have begun to find and whose DNA we have begun to read. These were not failures, they were steps. They were intermediate results, beings that proved the basic architecture was sound, that the modified hominid brain could sustain greater complexity, that the experiment's direction was correct. But they were not the final product, and when the final product was ready, when the full suite of modifications had been determined, when the genetic recipe had been refined through generations of observation and adjustment, it was time for the second experiment. The one that worked, the one that became us. The sudden sapiens. Homo sapiens appears in the fossil record approximately 300,000 years ago in Morocco at a site called Jebel Irhoud. But the remarkable thing is not when we appear, but how we appear. Not gradually, emerging from a series of intermediate forms with each generation showing slightly more modern anatomy and behavior, but suddenly, with a suite of anatomical and behavioral features that have no clear precursor in the immediately preceding hominid populations. The behavioral modernity of Homo sapiens, the capacity for abstract thought, symbolic art, complex planning, long-distance trade networks, sophisticated tool-making technologies, and eventually agriculture and civilization, appears in the archaeological record not as a slow accumulation, but as what researchers call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, or the Great Leap Forward, an explosion of cultural complexity that occurs within a geologically instant span of time, approximately 50 to 70,000 years ago. The bones were there earlier, but the mind, as evidenced by the material culture left behind, seems to have arrived later and suddenly, as if a switch was thrown, as if the hardware had been installed and waited, running on low power, until the software finally loaded. What turned on the software? In biological terms, most scientists now believe it was a relatively minor genetic change affecting the FOXP2 gene, the gene most directly associated with the capacity for the kind of fine motor control of the vocal tract required for complex language, combined with changes in several other genes regulating brain development and neural connectivity. Small changes with enormous consequences. The difference between a being that could make sounds and a being that could speak. The difference between an animal that lived in the moment and a being that could construct a narrative of past, present, and future. The difference between a creature of instinct and a creature of story. Who changed that gene? Natural selection? Perhaps. But natural selection is slow, and the FOXP2 changes in humans are so different from those in our nearest relatives that the mutation rate implied by standard evolutionary theory doesn't quite add up. The modifications look, to at least some geneticists who study them, like the kind of changes that would be more efficiently explained by deliberate engineering than by blind selection. They look, in other words, like the work of the seed bearers returning to their garden to make one final, critical adjustment. The black fluid, the substance of transformation. In every tradition where the creation of humanity is described in detail, there is always a substance, a medium, something that bridges the gap between what was and what was being made. The Sumerians called it the divine blood or the divine clay. The Egyptians called it the Nun, the primordial waters containing the potential for all things. The Mesoamericans spoke of corn, of divine grain saturated with the essence of the Creator. The Vedic texts spoke of Soma, the divine drink that the gods themselves consumed, and that, in diluted form, gave humans their connection to the divine realm. In the metaphor of the film Prometheus, which, for all its fictional framing, draws on a coherent mythological and philosophical tradition, it is the black fluid, a substance that rewrites biological information systems at the most fundamental level, that tears apart existing genetic structures and rebuilds them according to a new template. A substance that looks like death because, in one sense, it is death, the death of what you were as the prerequisite for the becoming of what you will be. What was this substance in the actual story we are reconstructing? Not black fluid in the cinematic sense, obviously, but the concept it represents, a medium capable of transmitting genetic information from one being to another, capable of rewriting the code, is not science fiction. It is, in fact, exactly what viruses do, and it is, in a more sophisticated form, exactly what a sufficiently advanced genetic engineering technology would do. Retroviruses, viruses that write their genetic code directly into the DNA of their host, have been one of the primary drivers of genomic evolution throughout the history of life on Earth. Approximately 8% of the human genome consists of sequences derived from ancient retroviral infections, viral DNA that integrated into the germline of our ancestors and became a permanent part of our genetic inheritance.
Some of these ancient viral sequences have been co-opted by the genome and now serve vital functions. Some are involved in the development of the placenta, some in the regulation of gene expression in the brain. We are, in other words, partly made of the remnants of ancient viral infections. Our genome is a palimpsest, a text written over and over again, the older writing still visible beneath the new. And the question that presents itself when you look at the specific viral sequences embedded in the human genome and compare them to the viral sequences embedded in the genomes of other primates is not merely when did these infections occur, but was anyone directing them? We carry within ourselves the remnants of ancient interventions, sequences of foreign code woven into the genome of our ancestors by something that knew exactly what it was doing and why. The mechanism of divine transfer. Let us construct a scenario. It is not presented as fact, but as the most coherent synthesis of what the myths describe and what the biology shows. The engineers returning to Earth after a long absence assessed the current state of their garden. They found it rich with life. The primate lineage had developed far beyond what they had seeded, driven by millions of years of natural selection, and among the hominids there was now a species, let us call it Proto-Homo, a being close to what we would call Homo heidelbergensis, that had the basic architecture for what they wanted. The brain was large, the social structure was complex, the rudiments of tool use and fire management were present, but the critical capabilities, complex syntax, abstract symbolic thought, long-term temporal planning, the neurological infrastructure for language in the full sense were missing or underdeveloped. To add these capabilities through conventional breeding would take hundreds of thousands of years. To add them surgically by directly editing the genomes of individual existing organisms would be technically possible, but would require enormous resources applied to an enormous population, and any changes made would not be heritable. To add them through a vector, a designed biological agent capable of integrating specific genetic sequences into the germline of a population would be elegant, efficient, and could be accomplished by infecting a founder population with a carefully engineered retroviral agent that would spread through the population naturally as it reproduced. The black fluid is the vector. The divine blood is the retrovirus. The breath of God into the nostrils of Adam is the moment of infection that would, over the generations that followed, express itself as the gifts of language and consciousness and the capacity for the full range of human experience. This is not a comfortable reading. It turns the most sacred moment in human creation, the divine kiss, the breath of life, the pouring of the soul into the clay, into a biological event. It reduces the miraculous to the technical. But perhaps that is not degradation. Perhaps the miraculous is the technical, when the technique is sufficiently advanced and the intention behind it sufficiently profound. Perhaps there is no meaningful distinction between a creator who breathes a soul into clay through divine will and a being of vast knowledge who breathes a precisely engineered retroviral vector into the respiratory tract of an existing hominid and watches, with something very like awe and something very like terror, as the result begins to become something new. The unintended consequences. Every myth about the creation of humans includes an element of surprise. The being that emerged was not exactly what was planned. The clay, animated, surprised the potter. The modification, once expressed, produced effects that had not been entirely foreseen. The Sumerian texts are explicit. The first humans created by Enki and Ninmah were not perfect. They came out wrong in various ways. Some could not hold food, some could not see, some could not speak. These are described as experimental failures, beings that had to be refined through further iterations.
But the more interesting surprise came later. When the properly formed humans were produced, they turned out to be more cognitively capable than intended. They could not only work, they could think. They could not only follow instructions, they could ask why those instructions existed. They could not only survive, they could contemplate mortality. They were, in ways the engineers had not fully anticipated, aware of themselves. The Garden of Eden myth, which is the Mesopotamian creation myth filtered through the Hebrew tradition, captures this perfectly. The humans in the garden were not supposed to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That is to say, there were things the engineers did not want their creation to know. There was a limit set on human cognitive capability, or rather, a limit set on human access to certain categories of knowledge that served the engineers' purposes. Humans were meant to work and procreate and maintain the earth. They were not meant to know too much about their own nature, about the nature of the beings who had made them, about the framework of the world they inhabited. But the modification that was made to produce fully capable humans was not a simple addition of specific skills. It was, the biology suggests, a more global upgrade of the neural architecture, an increase in the general connectivity and processing power of the prefrontal cortex, accompanied by changes in the default mode network, the brain's internal narrative and self-modeling system, and in the neural circuits governing theory of mind, the capacity to model the mental states of others. These changes produced language, yes. They produced planning, yes. But they also produced self-awareness, curiosity, the compulsion to ask questions about origins and meaning, and the specific capability, fatal to the engineer's original plan, of being able to look at the beings who had made them and recognize that those beings were not the uncaused cause of all things, but were themselves contingent, mortal, imperfect. The humans looked at their creators and saw not gods, but people. Very powerful, very knowledgeable, very ancient people, but people nonetheless. Beings who had needs and desires and frustrations and conflicts among themselves. Beings who aged, who died, who made mistakes. And this recognition, this failure of the awe that the engineers had, perhaps intended to be permanent, was the beginning of everything that followed. The beginning of the long, complex, troubled relationship between the makers and the made that every mythology on Earth preserves in its bones. Children of the Code. What it means to be a made thing. We are born with a question in us. Every human being, at some point in their conscious life, confronts it. Why am I here? What is the purpose of my existence? Who or what am I at the most fundamental level? These questions drive religion, philosophy, science, art. They are the engine of human civilization. And if the story we have been assembling is true, they are not arbitrary existential anxieties, but the precise and predictable cognitive consequence of being a made thing that became too clever not to notice that it was made. Consider the profound strangeness of being human. Among all the species on Earth, we alone seem to be troubled by the fact of our existence. A wolf does not lie awake worrying about the meaning of wolfhood. An octopus does not develop complex rituals to appease the forces that govern the distribution of prey. A crow does not carve images of transcendent beings on the walls of its nest and bury its tools with its dead as offerings to unseen powers. Only we do these things. Only we are compelled by something in our cognitive architecture to seek desperately for an explanation of what we are and why we are here. From the perspective of natural selection alone, this is deeply mysterious. Consciousness, in the sense of phenomenal self-awareness, the experience of being something, the first-person quality of experience, seems to confer little direct survival advantage over and above the information processing capabilities that could exist without it. A robot programmed to detect danger and flee it does not need to feel afraid.
The computation is sufficient. Yet we feel. We feel extraordinarily. We feel the weight of our own mortality. We feel the beauty of the world and are devastated by its indifference. We fall in love in ways that frequently damage our reproductive fitness rather than enhancing it. We sacrifice ourselves for principles rather than genes. We are, from a purely evolutionary perspective, afflicted with a richness of inner experience that vastly exceeds any plausible survival requirement. Unless the richness of our inner experience was not an accident, unless it was a specification, unless someone wrote that specification into the code with purpose.
The Popol Vuh, Mayan creation epic. The first humans had wisdom and understood everything. They examined the four corners, the four angles of the sky and the earth. But this pleased the gods not at all. Were they not to be worshipped, to be revered above all things? They know too much. Their sight reaches to the farthest corners. They know everything at once. So the heart of heaven blew mist upon their eyes, as one breathes upon the face of a mirror, so that their eyes were slightly blurred. Now they could only see that which was close by. Only thus was lost the wisdom of the first human beings. This passage from the Popol Vuh is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of mythology. It is a precise description of a deliberate cognitive limitation imposed on human beings by their creators. The first humans could see everything. They had the full cognitive capabilities that the engineering had actually produced, which exceeded the intended specification. And the engineers were frightened by this. So they deliberately reduced human cognitive capability, fogged the mirror of human perception and understanding to produce a being that could serve the intended function without threatening the hierarchy of maker over made. The blowing of mist on the mirror of human cognition, the tree of knowledge from which we were forbidden to eat, the theft of fire by Prometheus, fire here as metaphor for the full suite of knowledge and capability that was meant to be kept from human hands. These are not separate myths. They are the same story told in different cultural dress. The story of a cognitive limitation deliberately imposed on a created being, and the being's struggle, sometimes successful, sometimes catastrophic, to transcend that limitation. What we were given and what was kept back. The genetic engineering that produced modern humans gave us, among other things, complex recursive language, the ability to think about our own thinking, a theory of mind so sophisticated that we can construct elaborate models of other people's mental states, the capacity for counterfactual reasoning, imagining how things might be different, and a default mode network, the brain's internal narrative system, that generates a continuous autobiographical self-narrative, an ongoing story of who we are and how we came to be here. That last capability, the narrative self, is perhaps the most profound and the most double-edged of all our cognitive gifts. It is what makes us fully conscious beings, capable of the rich inner life that distinguishes human experience from the experience of other animals. It is also what makes us unable to live fully in the present moment, as other animals do, unable to simply exist without asking what our existence means, unable to face our own mortality without the need to construct stories that give it meaning. We are, in other words, beings defined by our stories. We invented religion to tell the story of our relationship with the cosmos. We invented history to tell the story of our relationship with time. We invented science to tell the story of our relationship with physical reality. We invented art to tell the stories that cannot be told in any other way. Everything that makes us human is, at root, a storytelling act, an attempt to take the raw materials of experience and weave them into a narrative that makes existence bearable and purposeful.
And the grandest, most persistent, most universal story we tell is the one we have been telling in this chronicle, the story of our creation. Every culture that has ever existed has told it. Every civilization has preserved some version of the event. The details vary: the names of the gods, the specific mechanics of the making, the precise nature of what was given and what was withheld. But the core structure is invariant. Beings of great power and ancient knowledge made us, deliberately, for reasons that were their own. We were made from existing biological material plus something of theirs. We came out smarter than they intended, and the relationship between the makers and the made has been complicated ever since. Every religion ever invented is the same story wearing a different face. We were made for a reason, and we have spent all of history trying to remember what that reason was.
What was kept back? What is the mist on the mirror in concrete neurological and genetic terms? This is a question that modern neuroscience is only beginning to approach, and it approaches it from the wrong direction, asking what can the brain do, rather than what was the brain designed not to do. But there are hints. The famous 90% of the brain that we don't use, a pop psychology factoid that is often misquoted and misunderstood, but which points toward a real phenomenon, which is that large regions of the cortex have functions we do not fully understand and capabilities that are rarely, if ever, accessed by ordinary human consciousness, may be less unused than locked. Extraordinary cases of human cognitive capability, the mathematical prodigies who can perform calculations in their heads that computers struggle with, the synesthetes who experience color and sound and number as a unified perceptual field, the rare individuals who gain extraordinary artistic or mathematical ability after brain injuries, the so-called acquired savants, may be glimpses of what the architecture is capable of when the standard limiters are removed or damaged. The mist on the mirror is real. We are a species operating at a fraction of our designed capability. Whether that limitation was imposed by our makers as a deliberate management tool, whether it arose naturally as a safety measure of the engineering, preventing cognitive overload in an organism that was never meant to be running at full capacity, or whether it is simply the current state of a work in progress, a species in the middle of its evolutionary journey toward the full expression of its potential, is the question that underlies every spiritual and philosophical tradition our civilization has ever produced. The rebellion in heaven, when the makers turned upon each other. The story of our creation is also the story of a war among the creators themselves, a division of opinion, a philosophy of power among the beings who made us over what we should be, what we should know, and what our ultimate fate should be. We were not merely objects of creation. We were, from the beginning, the focal point of a conflict that predated us and that our creation both expressed and deepened. The Mesopotamian records are remarkably detailed about this conflict. Among the Anunnaki, the gods who made us, there were two primary factions, represented most clearly by the figures of Enki and Enlil. Enki was the god of wisdom, of the deep waters, of genetic knowledge and biological arts. He was the scientist among the gods, the engineer, the one whose understanding of life and its mechanisms was most profound. Enlil was the god of the sky, of command, of military authority and administrative power. He was the ruler among the gods, or at least he claimed the rulership, the one whose word was supposed to be law. In the texts, these two figures are in constant tension. Enlil views the humans primarily as instruments of divine purpose, labor units, servants, beings whose existence is justified entirely by their usefulness to the Anunnaki. He is the one who orders the flood, the mass extinction of humanity, when humans become too numerous, too loud, too disruptive to the divine order. He is the one who confuses human languages at Babel when humans begin to accumulate too much knowledge and power. He is the force of divine management, the enforcer of boundaries. Enki, by contrast, is consistently the human's advocate. He is the one who warns Utnapishtim, Noah, of the coming flood and enables the preservation of life. He is the one who repeatedly gives humans gifts of knowledge and technology that Enlil would prefer they not have. He is the Prometheus figure, the one who steals fire for humanity, not from some nameless force of nature, but from the specific political faction of his own people who believe that fire, knowledge, capability, power, should be kept from human hands. The Atrahasis Epic, Tablet 2. Enlil called the assembly of all the great gods. Their noise has become too much. I am losing sleep from the clamor of the people. We must send plague and disease to reduce their numbers, and if that fails, the great flood shall remove them entirely. But Enki went down to the house of the reeds and spoke, O reed wall, hear what I say. Man of Shurapak, son of Ubara Tutu, tear down your house and build a boat. Take aboard the seed of all living things. The assembly of the gods has decided to bring the flood. What was the nature of this conflict? At one level, it appears to be a straightforward political dispute. Two powerful beings with different philosophies about how to manage the beings they had created, each with their own allies and agendas. At a deeper level, it may reflect a genuine moral and philosophical disagreement that goes to the heart of what creation means. If you create a being with intelligence and consciousness, what are your obligations to that being? Do you have the right to destroy it when it becomes inconvenient? Do you have the right to keep it in ignorance? Do you have the right to treat your own children as slaves? Enlil would say yes. They are our creation. We have absolute sovereignty over them. Enki would say no. The act of creation generates obligations. A being that can suffer, that can love, that can ask why it is here, has a claim on its maker's respect that cannot be dismissed simply because the maker happens to be more powerful. This debate about the obligations of creators to their creations, about whether power justifies domination, about whether intelligence and consciousness generate moral status regardless of origin, is one of the most important debates in the history of human thought. And it is significant that it begins not in human philosophy, but in the oldest records of the beings who created us. The question of what we owe to the things we make is not a question we invented. It was first asked by our makers, and they did not agree on the answer. The war behind the stories. The mythology of nearly every ancient civilization preserves, in symbolic form, the record of actual conflicts among the beings who governed early humanity. The Greek Titanomachy, the war between the Titans and the Olympians, maps remarkably well onto the Mesopotamian conflict between older and newer generations of gods. The Hindu wars between the Devas and Asuras, the Norse conflicts between the Aesir and Vanir, the Egyptian war between Ra and the forces of chaos, Apep and Set. These are not mere metaphors for natural phenomena, storm versus sun, order versus chaos. They are, the records suggest, distorted memories of actual military or political conflicts among the beings who inhabited the earth before and alongside the first civilizations of modern humanity. Some of these conflicts, the texts hint, were fought over us, over what we were, what we should know, what our role in the cosmos should be, over whether we should be preserved or destroyed, over whether the experiment of creating conscious beings from modified hominid stock was a success to be built upon or a mistake to be corrected. Consider the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic,
which begins not with the creation of humans, but with a war among the gods, in which the young gods destroy the primordial mother Tiamat and build the world from her body. This is usually interpreted as a metaphor for the imposition of order on chaos, and that interpretation is not wrong. But it may also be a memory of something more specific, a conflict among the engineer factions, in which one group, the younger, more aggressive, more expansionist group represented by the god Marduk, defeated an older, more conservative faction and established the political conditions under which the creation of humanity became possible. Humans in the Enuma Elish are created specifically as a consequence of this victory, from the blood of the defeated general of the old order mixed with the clay of the earth.
We are, in other words, the children of a war we did not fight and cannot remember. We carry the genetic legacy of the winners, the faction of engineers who believed in our creation and fought for it. And somewhere in the deep structure of our mythology, we remember the losers too, the forces that opposed our making, that wanted us destroyed or diminished, that even now, the texts suggest, have not abandoned their original opposition to our existence. We are the children of a war we did not fight. The genetic legacy of the winners is in every cell of our bodies. The ideology of the losers echoes in every myth of a god who wanted to destroy us. This gives a new dimension to the religious traditions that speak of evil, of demonic forces, of a power opposed to human flourishing. The Zoroastrian dualism of Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, the Judeo-Christian figure of the adversary, the prosecutor, the one who argues against humanity in the divine court. These are not psychological projections of the human tendency to moralize conflict. They are, if the story we are reconstructing has any validity, memories of an actual faction, beings of great power who genuinely and philosophically opposed the creation of humanity, and who have, in various ways and in various epochs, acted on that opposition. The war in heaven is not over. That is the most disturbing implication of the texts, and the one that our sanitized religious traditions have done the most to obscure. The beings who wanted us destroyed did not simply accept defeat and retire from the field. They adapted, they changed tactics, and the history of our species, from the first civilizations to the present moment, can be read as the continuation of that ancient conflict, fought now on the terrain of human civilization, using humans themselves as the pieces on the board. The first humans, in the garden, before the garden ended. They were not primitive. That is the first and most important thing to understand about the first fully modern humans, the beings who emerged from the final stage of the engineering, the ones who carried the complete modification, the ones who would become the ancestors of every human being alive today. They were not primitive savages struggling in the dark. They were something extraordinary, beings of high biological sophistication, possessed of every cognitive tool they needed, standing at the beginning of the road that would eventually lead here. Picture them. They are physically indistinguishable from a modern human. You could put one in contemporary clothing and walk them through a modern city, and no one would notice anything unusual. Their brains are as large as ours, their vocal tracts as sophisticated, their hands as dexterous, their eyes as perceptive. They dream, they love, they grieve the dead with something that can only be called ritual, burying their companions with flowers, with food offerings, with objects of apparent symbolic significance, as if they believed or had been told that something continued beyond the moment of physical death. They lived in a world that was, in some respects, more generous than ours. The Earth 70,000 years ago was in one of its warmer interglacial periods. The forests were vast, the megafauna still abundant, the rivers and oceans full of life. In the regions where the first fully modern humans lived, East Africa primarily, though populations may have existed elsewhere simultaneously. The landscape was a mosaic of savanna and forest that provided an extraordinary abundance of food for beings clever enough to exploit it efficiently. And these beings were very clever indeed. But they did not live alone. And here the story enters territory that modern anthropology has only recently begun to document with genetic evidence, the territory of contact, of interaction, of interbreeding and cultural exchange between modern humans and the other hominid populations, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and the various other archaic human groups that were still present on Earth when our immediate ancestors emerged. The mixed inheritance. Every non-African person alive today carries approximately 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Every person of Asian, Australian, or Pacific Island ancestry also carries up to 5% Denisovan DNA. These are not trivial trace contaminations. They are substantial genetic contributions from other hominid species to the modern human genome, contributions that are still visible in our biology and that have real functional effects on traits ranging from immune function to hair color to the capacity to tolerate high altitudes. This means that modern humans, as they expanded out of Africa and across the world, encountered and interbred with the beings who were already there. The Neanderthals, who had lived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, were not simply displaced and replaced. They were partially absorbed. Their genetic legacy persists in us. And more importantly, what we absorbed from them may not have been merely genetic. It may have been cultural, behavioral, spiritual, a transmission of knowledge and practice from beings who had inhabited these landscapes for far longer than the newcomers, and who knew things about survival and navigation and the local spirit world, whatever that means in the context of this chronicle, that our ancestors did not. The Neanderthals were not the brutish, club-wielding primitives of 19th century imagination. Recent discoveries have revealed Neanderthal cave art, Neanderthal jewelry, eagle talons, shell beads, Neanderthal burial practices suggesting belief in an afterlife, Neanderthal care for the elderly and disabled, activities that cannot be explained by pure survival calculus and require something like symbolic thought, like ritual, like the capacity to maintain cultural practices that have no immediate survival value. The Neanderthals, in other words, were people. They were people who had been on Earth for hundreds of thousands of years and who had developed their own relationship with the world and with whatever powers they believed governed it. Imagined memory of the first contact. She came out of the forest at dusk, when the light was the color of old blood. She was not like them, shorter, more compact, with a face that caught the last sunlight differently. Her eyes were the same color as the river. She carried a child on her hip, wrapped in the hide of an animal they didn't recognize. She was not afraid of them. That was the first thing. The people from the south had never seen a creature that wore a human face and felt no fear. She held up her hand, open, palm out, the same gesture they used for peace, though they had never taught it to anyone beyond their own fires. Somehow, she already knew. The first modern humans spreading out of Africa encountered the Neanderthals somewhere in the Middle East or possibly in North Africa. What happened next was not, or not only, conquest and displacement. It was contact. The kind of contact that over generations produces mixed populations, hybrid cultures, and the strange transmission of knowledge that happens when two peoples who are different enough to be interesting to each other are similar enough to talk. The Neanderthals may have carried specific genetic variants, immune system variations, neurological variations, metabolic variations tuned to the specific environments of Europe and Asia that were genuinely valuable to modern humans moving into new territories. The genetic transmission that occurred between these populations was not random mixing. The Neanderthal DNA sequences that persisted in modern human genomes appear to have been selectively retained because they were useful. They were gifts, the last gift of a people who were passing from the world to the people who were replacing them. And perhaps there were other gifts, ones that leave no genetic trace. Stories, names for plants and their properties, navigation knowledge, astronomical observations accumulated over generations, the names of local spirits and how to appease them, the knowledge of where the prey gather in winter and where the honeybees build their hives, the practical technology of survival in landscapes that the newcomers had never seen before, knowledge that was absorbed into the new culture, transformed and carried forward, the Neanderthal contribution to human civilization, made invisible by the passage of time, but still present, somewhere, in the deepest layers of our oldest traditions. The Garden as Memory. The Garden of Eden, as preserved in Genesis, as paralleled in the Sumerian Eden, the Persian Ariana Vayeja, the Norse Asgard, the Greek Hesperides, the Hindu Svarga, was a real place. Not in the sense that a specific garden with a specific tree and a specific serpent was located at specific GPS coordinates, but real in the sense that it preserves a genuine memory of a time and condition of existence that was different from what followed. A time before the knowledge that carries its price. A time before the full weight of human consciousness descended. A time when the relationship between humans and their makers was more direct, more immediate, less fraught with the distance that self-awareness and pride and ambition would eventually create. In the oldest human cultures that have left any record, there is a universal memory of a golden age, a time when the gods walked among humans, when knowledge was freely given, when the boundaries between the divine and the human were permeable. This is not wishful thinking. It is not merely the human tendency to romanticize the past. It is a memory that is too specific, too cross-cultural, too structurally consistent to be mere nostalgia. Something like a golden age did occur. Something like gods did walk among humans, and something like a break, an exile, a falling away, a catastrophe did end it. What was the garden? It was the early period of human-engineer contact, the time when the engineers were still present on Earth in significant numbers, still engaged directly in the management of their creation, still teaching and guiding and intervening. The mythological garden is the memory of that direct relationship, a time when the questions, "Why am I here?" and "Who made me?" and "What is the purpose of all this?" had direct answers, were, in fact, not questions at all, because the being who could answer them was there, physically present, accessible, and not yet departed. The exile from the garden was the engineer's withdrawal. Whatever caused it, internal politics, external catastrophe, the maturation of the experiment to a point where intervention was no longer appropriate or possible, the withdrawal of direct divine presence from human experience was the most traumatic event in our prehistory. It left a wound that every religion in history has tried to heal. And the longing for that lost presence, the longing for the garden, for the direct encounter with the transcendent, for the answer to come from a voice rather than from the laborious methods of prayer and science and philosophy, is the deepest wound in the human soul. The gift they were never meant to have: fire, knowledge, and the cost of waking up. Prometheus was punished for giving fire to humans, not because fire is inherently dangerous, though it is, but because fire is the technology that enabled human independence. With fire, humans could cook food, extending the caloric range of their diet and enabling the development of a larger brain, since cooked food is more energy-dense and easier to digest. With fire, humans could work and socialize after dark, creating the conditions for the extended social bonding that drives cultural development. With fire, humans could smelt metal, fire pottery, process materials that would otherwise be inaccessible. Fire is not merely a tool, fire is the first step on the path to everything. The Prometheus myth is usually read as an allegory of human intellectual ambition, the theft of divine knowledge, the punishment for overreaching the boundaries set by the gods. But there is a more specific and more disturbing reading. What if Prometheus was not allegorical? What if it was a specific event, the unauthorized transmission of specific knowledge and technology to human beings by a member of the engineering class who had decided, against the prevailing political will of his peers, that humans deserved more than they had been given? In the mythological tradition, Prometheus is always clearly an engineer, a titan, one of the older order of divine beings, distinct from the Olympians who had replaced them in the divine hierarchy. He is specifically identified as a being of superior wisdom and foresight. His name means forethought in Greek. He has access to the divine fire, to the realm of the gods, but he also has a specific, evident affection for humanity that motivates him to risk his own punishment in order to benefit them. He is not a rebel without cause. He is a being who has made a considered moral choice, who has decided that the relationship between maker and made requires more of him than simple compliance with the directives of divine management.
Hesiod, Works and Days. Before Prometheus, men lived without evils, without toilsome work, and without diseases. But when he stole the fire, Zeus punished the race of men, and Prometheus was chained to the rock where an eagle came each day to eat his liver, which grew back by night. Yet Prometheus smiled in his chains and said, "I see the future. I see what humans will become, and I would do it again. I would do it 10,000 times again." The punishment of Prometheus, chained to a rock, eternally tormented, maps precisely onto the Sumerian story of Absu, the divine intelligence who opposed the younger gods and was imprisoned in the deep earth. It maps onto the Judeo-Christian figure of Lucifer, the light-bearer, who fell from heaven as a consequence of a rebellion that involved the transmission of forbidden knowledge to humanity. These are not coincidentally similar stories. They are versions of the same story, the story of an engineer who chose humanity over institutional loyalty and paid the price that the institution demands from those who defy it. But the gift was given. Whatever the cost to the giver, the fire was received. And having received it, humans began to change in ways that could not be reversed. The cascade of gifts. Fire came first in the mythological timeline, but fire was only the beginning. The records describe a period of intensive teaching, gods walking among humans, sharing knowledge of agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, law. The Sumerian tradition identifies specific gods as the teachers of specific disciplines: Enki for wisdom and water management, Inanna for war and love, a pairing that makes more sense when you understand that both involve the willingness to risk everything, Nin-Hersag for medicine and biology, Utu for law and justice. Every major category of human knowledge was, the records say, given as a gift, not discovered by humans through their own effort, but transmitted from the beings who had possessed that knowledge for far longer. In Egypt, the god Thoth,
the ibis-headed scribe, the keeper of divine records, was credited with giving humanity the gifts of writing, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. He was the intermediary between the divine and human realms, the being who translated divine knowledge into human form, who wrote down what the gods knew and gave it to human keepers. The emerald tablet, attributed to Thoth, or his later Greek incarnation, Hermes Trismegistus, is presented in tradition as a condensed encoding of all fundamental knowledge, a compressed transmission from the engineers to their creation, encoded in a form dense enough to be carried forward through time and cryptic enough to be meaningless to any being who lacked the key to decode it. In Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl brought civilization to humans, agriculture, the calendar, writing, the arts, the organization of society. In the Andean tradition, Viracocha, the bearded god who emerged from the waters, taught the same gifts to the peoples of the high altitudes. In every case, the structure is the same: a divine being, clearly distinguished from ordinary humanity by physical or behavioral characteristics that marked them as something other, arriving at a time of relative primitiveness and transmitting the knowledge that would transform a subsistence culture into a civilization. We received all of this, and we received something else, something that was not taught but given by the modification itself. Something that emerged from the architecture of the enhanced brain like a flower from a seed, the capacity for transcendence, the ability to have what every mystical tradition calls the peak experience, the moment of direct, unmediated contact with something vast and unified that lies beneath and beyond ordinary consciousness. The experience that returns from within the conviction that existence is not random, that meaning is real, that there is a presence behind the world that is not indifferent to our presence within it. This capacity for mystical experience, for direct apprehension of the transcendent, is neurologically real. It involves specific brain states, specific patterns of activation that can be induced or suppressed pharmacologically, that appear to correlate with activity and specific neural networks, that produce consistent phenomenological reports across cultures and centuries and individuals who have had no contact with each other. It is not delusion in the sense that it is not a malfunction of the brain. It is rather a function of the brain that operates rarely in states of unusual neural organization and that accesses something, we do not know what, that ordinary waking consciousness does not. Was this the deepest gift? Was the capacity for transcendence, for the direct experience of connection with something beyond the individual self, beyond the human species, beyond the biological substrate, the real fire that was stolen from heaven? Not agriculture, not writing, not mathematics, but the capacity to know, in some visceral and irreducible way, that we are not alone in the universe, that we were made by something that still exists, that our maker and we are, at the level that matters most, the same substance. The deepest gift was not fire and not writing. It was the capacity to remember, in the cells, in the soul, that we were made, and that our maker was not a stranger, but something we had once, before the exile, known. Every religious experience in human history, every mystical encounter, every vision of divine light and divine presence, all of it may be, on this reading, not wishful delusion, but accurate perception. The brain, in these unusual states, may actually be doing what it was designed to do, accessing the connection with the makers, feeling the thread that runs back through the engineering to the beings who planted their own essence in our genome. The mystic who says, "I touched God," may be, in a very literal, if unexpected sense, correct. They touched the residue of the beings who made them, the fragment of ancient, vast consciousness that was written into our DNA as a signature, as a calling card, as a promise of eventual return. The Watchers, those who stayed when the others left. Not all of the engineers left. When the main body of their presence withdrew from Earth for reasons and to destinations that remain among the deepest mysteries of this chronicle, a contingent remained. Some remained by assignment as observers and administrators of the human experiment. Some remained by choice, drawn to the strange, fierce, beautiful creatures they had helped make. And some remained because they fell in love with what they had made, and made choices in that love that horrified the faction that had ordered the withdrawal. The Book of Enoch, one of the most extraordinary documents in the human literary tradition, a Jewish apocalyptic text written around the 2nd century BCE, but preserving traditions that are far older, describes them explicitly. They are called the Watchers, a class of divine beings assigned to observe and guard humanity from above, to watch without interfering. But they watched too long. They watched until watching became longing, and longing became action. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves from whomever they chose. This line from Genesis 6:2 is one of the most mysterious and underexplored passages in the entire Hebrew Bible. In its context, it is a brief prelude to the flood narrative, a hint that something had gone wrong between humans and the divine order. But in the fuller Enochic tradition, it is the center of a detailed and disturbing story about what happened when the boundary between the makers and the made was crossed in the most intimate possible way. The Book of Enoch, chapter 6-7. In those days, when the children of men had multiplied, there were born to them beautiful and comely daughters. The angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, "Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men, and beget us children." And Semjaza, who was their leader, said unto them, "I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin." And they all answered him and said, "Let us all swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations, not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing." Then they took wives, each to himself, and began to go in unto them and defile themselves with them, and taught them charms and enchantments. The Watchers descended, 200 of them, the text says, led by a being named Semjaza, with specific angels named for specific functions: Azazel, who taught humans the making of weapons and the arts of war; Barakiel, who taught astrology; Kokabiel, who taught knowledge of the stars; Ezekiel, who taught knowledge of the clouds; Sariel, who taught the course of the moon. The Watchers came down to Mount Hermon, a specific named location, and made a specific intentional choice to abandon their observer status and participate directly in human life. They took human partners, and from these unions between beings whose biology was a millennium ahead of ours and humans who were biologically their modified offspring, came the Nephilim. The text is not entirely clear about what the Nephilim were. Giants, the most common translation says, but the word Nephilim comes from a root meaning those who fell or those who were cast down. It refers to the origin of the beings rather than their physical size, though extraordinary physical size and capability may have been a consequence of the hybrid biology. The Nephilim were, in other words, a second generation of human engineer hybrids, produced not by the careful, controlled engineering of the original creation, but by the spontaneous mixing of two populations whose genomes were closely enough related, since humans had been engineered from hominid stock using engineered genetic material, to produce viable offspring. but different enough that those offspring would have inherited an unpredictable combination of traits from both lineages.
The teachers among the humans. The watchers who came down were, by the description of the texts, simultaneously a blessing and a catastrophe. They were a blessing because they brought knowledge, extraordinary practical knowledge that accelerated human cultural development enormously. The knowledge of metallurgy, Azazel's gift, of agriculture and plant genetics, of medicine, of astronomical calendrics, of writing systems that could encode complex information. All of this was transmitted directly by beings who understood it at the deepest level to human communities that absorbed it with the enthusiasm of students who have been waiting for the teacher. This is why, if you look at the archaeological record of the Neolithic period, the period from roughly 10,000 years ago when humans first developed agriculture and began building settlements, the pace of cultural development is so strikingly fast. In geological terms, it is essentially instantaneous, the transition from scattered bands of hunter-gatherers to the fully formed civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley takes only a few thousand years. Civilization, as we normally understand it, does not develop gradually. It appears with a complexity and sophistication that it should have taken far longer to accumulate, as if it was taught rather than discovered. The earliest Sumerian cities, Eridu, Uruk, are not the beginning of a long development curve. They are already, in their earliest recoverable forms, fully functioning urban centers with complex social organization, professional specialization, written administration, astronomical observation, and monumental architecture. The people who built them were not figuring things out from scratch. They knew what they were doing. Someone had taught them. But the Watchers were also a catastrophe, or more precisely, their presence and the results of their presence were perceived as catastrophic by the faction of engineers who had ordered the withdrawal and mandated non-interference. The unauthorized teaching, the unauthorized reproduction, the existence of the Nephilim as an uncontrolled variable in the human population, all of this was, from the management perspective, a serious breach of the protocol that had been established when the engineers withdrew. The Great Flood, a deletion when the administrators decided to begin again. The flood is in everything, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Atrahasis, in Genesis, in the Vedic Shatapatha Brahmana, in the Mayan Popol Vuh, in the Aztec accounts of the previous world ages, in the Australian Aboriginal traditions of a rising sea, in the myths of the Pacific Islands, of West Africa, of the indigenous peoples of North America. It is so universal, so structurally consistent across cultures with no demonstrable contact with each other, that it must record something that actually happened, and it did. The most recent analysis of geological and genetic data suggests that the last major global flooding event, the one that most likely underlies the worldwide flood mythology, occurred approximately 11,000 to 12,000 years ago at the end of the Younger Dryas period, when the massive ice sheets of the last glacial maximum finally and catastrophically melted. Sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters over this period, not instantaneously, but in fits and starts, with periods of rapid rise that would have been experienced by coastal populations as sudden, devastating inundations. The flooding of the Black Sea Basin, a freshwater lake that was catastrophically connected to the Mediterranean approximately 7,500 years ago, flooding a populated lowland area roughly the size of France in a geological instant, may be the specific event that underlies the Near Eastern flood traditions. But the geological record alone does not explain the mythological record. The myths do not describe a natural disaster. They describe a decision. They describe a deliberate act by the gods, an intentional flooding, opposed by at least one faction of the divine council, carried out by the dominant faction over the objection of the God who loved humanity and chose to preserve a representative sample of it against the coming deletion. In the Atrahasis, Enlil sends the flood specifically to silence humanity. Their noise and multiplication had become intolerable to the divine order. In the Gilgamesh epic, the same basic narrative. The gods decide to destroy humanity. Utnapishtim, Noah, is warned by a friendly god, builds a boat, survives. In Genesis, the same. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, a description that maps onto the Enochic tradition of the Nephilim and the unauthorized knowledge transfer, and decides to blot out man whom I have created. The flood was not punishment, it was deletion, an administrator's decision to reset the experiment to the last stable configuration before the unauthorized variables had been introduced into the human genome. He was preserved precisely so that the experiment could continue from a controlled starting point once the deletion was complete. The preserved specimens. The instruction to take 2 of every kind onto the ark is, in modern terms, the instruction to preserve a genetic seed bank. This is a procedure that any civilization engaged in long-term biological management of a species would understand immediately. If you need to reset a population, if some uncontrolled modification has introduced dangerous variables into a gene pool and you need to start again from the original baseline, you need to preserve the original genome in as complete a form as possible. You preserve breeding pairs. You preserve genetic diversity. You ensure that the post-reset population can recover its full viability. The ark, in this reading, was not a wooden boat large enough to hold every species on Earth, a physical impossibility that has tortured literal interpreters for centuries. It was a preservation facility, possibly a physical vessel, possibly something more technologically sophisticated, that held a representative sample of the genetic material needed to re-establish the intended human population and the ecological context that human civilization would need to sustain itself. The specific instructions given to Noah, the dimensions of the ark, the categories of animals to be preserved, the sequence of events, have the quality of protocol documentation. They are not the descriptions of a man in a panic trying to figure out how to save his family from a rising flood. They are the descriptions of a procedure being carried out according to specification, communicated by a being who had done this before and knew exactly what was required. Here is the detail that most interpreters skip past. Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh epic is afterward made immortal by the gods and installed in a paradise at the mouth of the rivers. He becomes, in other words, a permanent resident of the divine realm, someone who is extracted from the human population and kept in a condition that prevents him from interacting with the reconstituted population that follows the flood. The Noah of Genesis is not made immortal, but his post-flood life is described in terms that suggest a different status. He lives for 950 years, far beyond the lifespans assigned to later biblical figures. He is kept separate. His genome is kept pure. He is, in a very literal sense, the backup copy, preserved and isolated from the reset population, available to be consulted or used if needed. Whatever was lost in the deletion, in the reset, it was considerable. The mythological traditions agree that what came before the flood was, in some respects, superior to what came after. The antediluvian world, the world before the flood, is described in every tradition as a place of greater knowledge, greater longevity, greater connection between the human and divine realms. The Sumerian king list assigns lifespans of tens of thousands of years to the pre-flood kings. The biblical patriarchs before Noah lived for 800 and 900 years.
Plato's Atlantis, the great civilization that was swallowed by the sea, possessed knowledge and capabilities that the post-flood civilizations struggled to rediscover. Something was lost. Something real and significant was lost in the transition from the pre-flood world to the post-flood world. Whether that loss was genetic, the Nephilim hybrids and their capabilities removed from the population, cultural, the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years of direct human-engineer interaction erased by the destruction of whatever physical records existed, or both. The result was a humanity rebuilt from a smaller, less complex, less connected starting point. The civilization we have today is a recovery, not a progression from nothing, but a rebuilding from almost nothing, guided, we will see in the chapters that follow, by the survivors of the deletion and by whatever help they received from the beings who, even after the reset, continued to take an interest in our development.
Survivors and second chances. The rebuild begins. The world after the flood was not empty. The deletion was never total. It could not be, given the global distribution of humanity by the time the catastrophe occurred. Small populations in isolated regions survived the flooding of the coastlines and river valleys. Populations in the highlands of Africa, Asia, the Americas, Australia, people who had lived beyond the reach of both the rising seas and the specific targeting of the flood event, continued, unaware that anything had ended. For them, nothing had been deleted. For them, the old world was still the world. But for the civilizations of the coastal lowlands, for the cultures that had been most directly in contact with the Watchers and their teachings, the cultures that had accumulated the most sophisticated knowledge and built the most complex social structures, the reset was devastating. The cities built near the rivers were swallowed. The records were destroyed. The teachers, the Watchers themselves, the surviving Nephilim, the elder beings who had been the custodians of knowledge, were either killed, withdrawn, or so thoroughly scattered as to be effectively gone. A civilization that had taken thousands of years to build was, in the course of a generation, reduced to scattered refugees carrying fragmentary memories of everything they had lost. These refugees are perhaps the most important figure in the history of civilization, the survivor carrying knowledge. They are in every tradition. The Egyptian accounts of the followers of Horus, a group of beings described as both divine and human, who preceded the pharaonic dynasties and established the sacred geography and religious framework of what would become Egyptian civilization. The Mesopotamian accounts of the 7 sages, the Apkallu, who came out of the sea after the flood and taught the arts of civilization to the survivors. Plato's Solon meeting an Egyptian priest who says, "You Greeks are always children, you have no knowledge that is old," implying the preservation of pre-flood knowledge in the temple archives of Egypt long after it had been lost elsewhere. The Mayan tradition of the men of knowledge who came from the east across the sea and taught civilization to the people they found. The 7 sages. The Apkallu, the 7 sages of Mesopotamian tradition, are among the most fascinating figures in all of ancient mythology. They are depicted consistently in Mesopotamian art as human in form, but with additional features. Most commonly, they are shown wearing fish suits, garments that make them look like beings encased in the body of a fish, or with the head of a fish above their own human face. They are associated with the god Enki, the pro-humanity faction of the Divine Council, and are described as coming up from the Abzu, the deep underground freshwater sea, to teach civilization to humans after the flood. The fish imagery is significant. In the ancient world, fish were associated with the primordial waters, with the sea as the origin of life, with the before,
the condition that preceded the current world. A being encased in a fish is a being wrapped in the shell of what came before, a being from the pre-flood world preserved in some medium, water, a submersible vessel. The metaphor of the fish suit does not specify, and emerging into the post-flood world as a messenger from the lost age. The Apkallu were not fully human. The texts are explicit about this. They were 2/3 divine, hybrid beings, possibly the Nephilim or their descendants, who carried in their biology the enhanced capabilities of the Watcher modification without being pure engineer stock. They were, in other words, exactly the kind of beings you would select to carry civilization forward if you wanted the transmission to work. Human enough to communicate with the survivors and be understood by them, divine enough to retain the knowledge and capabilities that ordinary humans would not have been able to preserve through the catastrophe.
The teaching of Oannes, as recorded by Berosus. In the first year there appeared from that part of the Erythraean Sea which borders upon Babylonia an animal destitute of reason by name Oannes, whose whole body was that of a fish, but who had under a fish's head another head, and also feet below, similar to those of a man. This being was accustomed to pass the day among men, but took no food at that season, and he gave them an insight into letters and sciences and arts of every kind. He taught them to construct cities, to found temples, to compile laws, and explained to them the principles of geometrical knowledge. He made them distinguish the seeds of the earth and showed them how to collect the fruits. In short, he instructed them in everything which could tend to soften manners and humanize their life. When the sun set, it was the custom of this being to plunge again into the sea and abide all night in the deep, for he was amphibious. Oannes, the fish sage of Babylonian tradition, described by the ancient Babylonian historian Berosus from documents that no longer exist, is one of the most specific and extraordinary figures in all of ancient literature. He is clearly not human. He enters the sea at night. He takes no food. He is clearly not an ordinary animal. He teaches mathematics, architecture, law, agriculture. He is clearly some kind of hybrid or disguised being who has chosen a form that marks his liminality, his existence between worlds. He is a being from the old world, wearing the form of the transition between worlds, the fish, the sea, the emergence from water, teaching the new world what it needs to rebuild.
What did these survivors teach? Not everything that had existed before. That would have been too much, too fast, and the engineers who had permitted the flood would presumably have opposed any attempt to simply restore the pre-flood civilization in full. They taught a curated package, the minimum viable civilization. The agricultural techniques needed to feed a settled population. The architectural principles needed to build structures that would last. The astronomical knowledge needed to maintain an accurate calendar. The writing systems needed to record and transmit knowledge. The legal frameworks needed to organize complex societies. The mathematical tools needed to manage large-scale engineering projects. Enough to rebuild. Not everything that had been lost. Enough to start again. And in the most sacred, most guarded spaces of the civilizations that emerged from this teaching, in the inner sanctums of the temples, in the restricted texts accessible only to the highest initiates, in the esoteric traditions that every civilization maintained in parallel with its public religion, they preserved something more. They preserved the full story. The story of the creation, of the Watchers, of the flood, of the original purpose of humanity and the original plan for our future. They preserved it not because they were certain of its truth, but because they understood that some stories are too important to lose, even if their full meaning has been forgotten. The architects of civilization, how the rebuilt world was shaped. Somewhere between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago, in a relatively tiny portion of the global landmass, civilization was simultaneously and independently invented and then disseminated at a speed that does not match what independent invention would predict across the world. The paradox of civilization's origins, how it happened so fast, in so many places, with so much structural similarity, is one of the most underappreciated mysteries in all of history. Let us establish the facts first, stripped of interpretation. Agriculture, the systematic cultivation of crops and the herding of domesticated animals, was developed in at least 7 separate locations around the world within a period of roughly 6,000 years. The Fertile Crescent, around 11,500 years ago. China, around 9,000 years ago. New Guinea, around 9,000 years ago. Sub-Saharan Africa, around 5,000 years ago. Mesoamerica, around 9,000 years ago. South America, around 10,000 years ago. Eastern North America, around 4,000 years ago. In each location, local plant and animal species were domesticated. In each location, the transition from nomadic hunter-gathering to settled agriculture took place within a time window that is, in evolutionary terms, essentially simultaneous. This simultaneity is deeply puzzling from a purely diffusionist perspective, the idea that agriculture was invented once and spread from a single source. The geographical and temporal pattern doesn't fit a single origin model, but it also doesn't quite fit a model of pure independent invention, the structural similarities too consistent. As if something happened approximately 11 to 12,000 years ago that created the conditions for agricultural development simultaneously in many locations. As if some key element was supplied, a seed, a technique, a piece of knowledge that crossed the barriers between populations that had no contact with each other. The Neolithic Revolution's hidden architecture. The specific cereals that were domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, wheat, barley, emmer, are extremely demanding crops in terms of their management requirements. They require knowledge of soil preparation, planting timing calibrated to seasonal cycles, irrigation management, pest control, grain storage, and processing. None of this knowledge is trivial. The genetic modifications required to transform wild grasses into productive grain crops took hundreds of years of deliberate selection. And the cultural transformations required to shift a population from the mobility of hunting and gathering to the labor-intensive, geographically fixed regime of grain agriculture require social and institutional innovations, property rights, storage rights, labor organization, conflict management, that are far from obvious. The first farmers were not people who stumbled accidentally upon a good idea. They were people who had received instruction. The mythological record is, again, explicit. Demeter gave agriculture to the Greeks, and specifically to the hero Triptolemus, who then carried it to the whole world. Osiris gave it to the Egyptians. The feathered serpent gave it to Mesoamerica. In each case, a divine figure, a specific act of teaching, a human recipient charged with disseminating the gift. The Göbekli Tepe site in southern Turkey, the world's oldest known monumental structure, built approximately 11,500 years ago, adds another layer of mystery to the picture. It was built by people who, by all archaeological evidence, had not yet developed agriculture. It was a hunter-gatherer culture that somehow mobilized the organizational capacity to cut, transport, and erect multi-ton limestone pillars, carving them with sophisticated relief sculptures of animals and abstract symbols, and arranging them in elaborate circular patterns that have astronomical alignments of extraordinary precision. Göbekli Tepe was not built by a civilization that was just figuring out how to organize itself. It was built by a culture that already possessed the organizational, logistical, and astronomical knowledge required for monumental construction, and that possessed these things before it developed agriculture, reversing the developmental sequence that every standard model of civilization predicts. The standard model says first agriculture, then surplus, then hierarchy, then monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe says first monumental architecture, then apparently everything else, as if the knowledge came first and the civilization was built around preserving and applying that knowledge. Göbekli Tepe was not built by people who were figuring out civilization. It was built by people who had already been taught and who built it to remember who had taught them. The site was deliberately buried approximately 8,000 years ago. Its builders went to enormous effort to fill in the structures with carefully sorted debris, a deliberate act of concealment that suggests intentional preservation rather than abandonment. They buried it so it would last. They buried it so that someone coming after them might find it and know that it had been there, that they had been there, that the knowledge had been there at the beginning, at the source, before the long forgetting set in. We found it in 1994. We have understood, so far, perhaps 5% of what it means. The Sumerian miracle. But it is Sumer that presents the most arresting case. Mesopotamian civilization, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now southern Iraq, did not develop gradually. Around 3500 BCE, from what appears in the archaeological record to be a relatively uncomplicated agricultural society, something extraordinary happened. Full urban civilization, including writing, mathematics, formal legal codes, monumental architecture, professional specialization, long-distance trade, astronomical observations, and complex religious institutions appeared within a period of a few centuries. The Sumerians themselves explained this in their king lists and temple hymns. Civilization was given to them by the Anunnaki, specifically by Enki, who provided the May, the divine formulas, the tablets of destiny on which all the arts of civilization were encoded. The Sumerians did not believe they had invented their civilization. They believed they had received it. And the precision of their astronomy, the sophistication of their mathematics, the complexity of their legal codes, achieved in the earliest centuries of their civilization without the centuries of trial and error that should have been necessary, is most easily explained if they had, indeed, received it from beings who already possessed it. Consider, the Sumerians knew that the earth was round and that it orbited the sun, knowledge that the West would not rediscover until Copernicus in the 16th CE. They knew the correct order of the planets in the solar system. They had a mathematical system, base 60, that we still use today for measuring time, 60 seconds, 60 minutes, and angles, 360 degrees in a circle. Their medical texts describe surgical procedures, herbal pharmacologies, and diagnostic categories that would not be matched in their sophistication until the modern era. Their legal system, the Code of Ur-Nammu, the oldest known legal code, established principles, presumption of innocence, standard weights and measures, protection of the weak from the strong, that we still consider fundamental to justice. None of this was developed from scratch by people who had, a century earlier, been simple farmers. All of it reads as a transmission, as knowledge received from a source that possessed it fully formed and passed it on to human recipients who were equipped to use it, but did not originate it. The maps in stone. What was encoded in the ancient monuments? They are everywhere. The great stone structures that our ancestors built with a precision and at a scale that we still, with all our modern engineering, find difficult to match. The pyramids of Giza, the stone circles of Britain, the megalithic temples of Malta, the oldest freestanding structures on Earth. the precision-cut polygonal masonry of Peru that fits stones of hundreds of tons together without mortar in joints so tight that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. The underground cities of Cappadocia, carved from living rock, capable of housing tens of thousands of people. All over the world, on every continent, our ancestors erected structures of staggering technical ambition and encoded in those structures deliberately a body of information that they wanted to survive the ages. The Great Pyramid of Giza is not a tomb. This is not a fringe claim anymore. It is the position of a growing number of Egyptologists and engineers who have studied the structure in detail. The pyramid is, among other things, a geodetic monument. Its dimensions encode with extraordinary precision the dimensions of the Earth. The ratio of the pyramid's perimeter to its height times 2 pi gives the circumference of the Earth. The pyramid's position on the globe at exactly 30 degrees north latitude is precise to within a fraction of a degree. Its orientation to true north is accurate to within a tiny fraction of a degree, an accuracy that requires not merely good surveying tools, but a deep understanding of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of true north to shift over cycles of approximately 26,000 years. The builders of the Great Pyramid of Giza knew about the precession of the equinoxes. They knew the exact dimensions of the Earth. They knew the value of pi. They positioned their structure at a geographically significant point on the Earth's surface with a precision that was not exceeded by modern surveying technology until the 20th century. And they built it to last. The Great Pyramid, at nearly 5,000 years of age, remains structurally sound, its core intact, its precision preserved against the erosion of millennia.
This is not the achievement of a civilization that had recently graduated from the Stone Age. This is the achievement of a civilization possessed of a sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, geodesy, and engineering that had been developed over a very long time, or received from a source that had developed it over a very long time. The information encoded. What were they trying to preserve in stone? Multiple independent researchers approaching the great monuments from different angles, archaeoastronomy, sacred geometry, archaeogeography, have converged on a similar answer. They were preserving a map. Not a map of territories in the ordinary sense, a map of knowledge, the dimensions of the Earth, the cycles of the heavens, the location of other significant sites, and, most controversially, a map of time. A marker indicating not merely the present, but the future. Specific astronomical configurations that would recur at specific intervals, allowing a civilization with the knowledge to read the monument, to determine precisely when it was built, and to calculate forward to predicted dates of significance. The Mayan long count calendar, the calendar that ended on December 21, 2012, and which, contrary to popular misunderstanding, simply marked the end of one great cycle and the beginning of another, is perhaps the most explicit example of this temporal encoding. The Mayans tracked not only the solar year, but also the Venus cycle, 584 days, the sacred 260-day ritual calendar, the 360-day Hab year, and great cycles of 13 Bactans, each approximately 5,126 years. The coincidence of these cycles produced dates of astronomical significance that the Mayan priests calculated and recorded with extraordinary precision. To track these cycles correctly requires mathematical knowledge of a complexity that the Mayan civilization should not, by standard developmental models, have possessed.
Do you not know, Asclepius, that Egypt is the image of heaven? It is the projection of the entire course of heavenly things on earth below. But a time will come when it may seem that Egypt had worshipped the gods in vain, and all her holy service be infutile. For those gods will depart from earth and go back to heaven. They will abandon Egypt. Then Egypt will be left, a widow forsaken by gods and men alike. Then will strangers occupy the land, and not only will sacred rites be neglected, but, what is worse, it will be decreed that religion, piety, and the worship of gods are forbidden under pain of penalty. The gods will return to heaven, having forsaken mankind. The earth will become unstable, and the sea unnavigable. Heaven will be held up by no stars. All voices of the gods will of necessity be silenced. The Hermetic texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the Greek version of the Egyptian Thoth, speak plainly of a time when the divine presence will withdraw from earth, not as punishment but as a natural consequence of a cycle completing itself. The gods will leave, the knowledge they brought will be partially lost, and the monuments they inspired, the great stone records, the encoded temples, the astronomical alignments, will stand as the only surviving witnesses of what was once known and what will, when the cycle turns again, be needed. The stone monuments are not architecture, they are messages. They are letters written in mathematics and geometry and astronomical alignment, addressed to a civilization capable of reading them, which means a civilization that has redeveloped the mathematical and astronomical knowledge that their builders possessed. They are messages from the past to a future that their builders predicted would come, a future in which the teachers were gone, the direct knowledge was lost, and the only remaining evidence of the true story of human origins was what had been encoded in stone, too heavy to destroy, too precise to mistake for accident. They are, in a very real sense, letters from our makers to us, left in the only medium that could survive the long silence between their departure and our arrival at the threshold of understanding them. We are now beginning to read them. We are now beginning to ask the questions whose answers are already in the stone, if we can learn to hear what the stone is saying.
Gods who bled. The divine ones who walked among us in the age of memory. The gods of ancient memory were not abstractions. They were not forces of nature given human faces. They were, in the accounts that preserve them most faithfully, specific beings with specific names, specific personalities, specific histories, specific relationships with specific human individuals and communities. They were beings who aged, slowly by human standards, but visibly, who could be wounded, who could die, who ate and drank and reproduced and argued and made mistakes, and sometimes expressed something that can only be read as remorse. The Egyptian texts are particularly specific about the physical nature of the divine presence on earth. The pyramid texts, among the oldest religious texts in existence, inscribed on the walls of 5th dynasty pyramids around 2400 BCE, but preserving traditions far older, describe a time called Zep Tepi, the first time, when the gods themselves lived on earth and ruled it directly. The gods were present. They had physical bodies. They worked. They built. They established the social and religious order. And then, at some point, they rose to heaven. They departed, leaving their human successors, the pharaohs, as their representatives and the maintainers of the divine order they had established. The pharaoh's divine status was not merely religious symbolism. The ancient Egyptians were unusually literal about the nature of divine kingship. The pharaoh was divine because the pharaoh was the literal offspring, or at least the genetic representative of the divine lineage, the line that connected back through the followers of Horus to the original divine presence of the first time. The royal bloodline was maintained with extraordinary care, including the notorious custom of sibling marriage, designed not for power consolidation, the standard explanation, but for the preservation of specific genetic traits that distinguished the royal line from ordinary humanity.
What genetic traits? The Egyptian texts don't specify in biological terms, but they are clear about functional terms. The pharaoh possessed a quality called Heka, usually translated as magic, but better understood as the ability to command reality through the precise use of language and will. The pharaoh could heal the sick by laying on hands. The pharaoh could communicate directly with the divine realm without intermediary. The pharaoh's dreams were prophetic. In short, the pharaoh exhibited capabilities consistent with a stronger expression of the engineer genetic legacy, the divine component of the human genome, that ordinary humans expressed more weakly or not at all. The bloodlines. Every ancient culture that preserved an account of its origins described a specific genealogy connecting its ruling class to the divine beings who had once been present. The Sumerian kings traced their descent to the gods. The Egyptian pharaohs traced their descent through the Horus kings to Osiris himself. The Greek heroes, Heracles, Achilles, Theseus, were explicitly half-divine, born of human mothers and divine fathers. The Indian epics describe dynasties of solar and lunar descent, tracing lineage back through the great sages to the original creator beings. The Chinese emperor was the son of heaven. Every culture, a special bloodline connecting the rulers to the makers. This is usually interpreted as political mythology, the ruling class claiming divine descent to legitimize their power. And that interpretation is not wrong, but it may not be the whole story. The consistency of the genealogical structure across cultures, the specific claim of actual biological descent from divine human union, is more specific and more persistent than pure political mythology would require. Political mythology needs the appearance of divine favor, not the specific claim of biological relatedness. What if the bloodlines were real? What if the descendants of the Watcher human unions, the Nephilim and their descendants, did not all perish in the flood? What if some survived, or were deliberately preserved, and became the basis for the divine kingship systems that appear at the dawn of every known civilization? The hybrid beings who possessed the stronger expression of the engineered genetic legacy, better memory, longer lifespans, heightened sensory and cognitive capabilities, possibly the capacity for the kind of directed intentionality that the ancient world called magic, would have been obvious candidates for leadership in communities that were just rebuilding civilization from the ruins of the deletion. The king was not divine because the people said so. The king was divine because the king was different, older in blood, longer in memory, carrying in the genome the echoes of a making more ancient than the flood and the forgetting. Over thousands of years, the original divine bloodlines diluted. As the ruling classes of the early civilizations mixed through conquest, treaty, alliance, and the simple mathematics of population with the broader human population, the engineered genetic legacy became more dispersed, more dilute, less clearly expressed. The gods who bled became the pharaohs who were divine in title. The pharaohs became the kings who ruled by divine right. The kings became the aristocracies who claimed noble blood. The aristocracies became the elites who claimed superior intelligence and character. The divine gradually became the social, as the biological reality of the original difference was forgotten and replaced by its institutional echo. But the genes did not disappear. They diluted, they spread, they recombined in unpredictable ways in populations across the world. and occasionally, in individuals whose genetic inheritance happened to combine the right variants in the right configuration, the old capabilities reappeared. The great sages, the prophets, the mystics, the individuals who, in every era and every culture, reported direct contact with the transcendent, who could heal or prophesy or access knowledge they had no ordinary means of possessing. These were not frauds, or not all of them. Some of them were people in whom the engineer legacy expressed itself strongly enough to pierce the mist that had been placed on the mirror of human cognition. The history of religion is, in part, the history of such individuals and the history of the institutions that formed around them, that preserved their experiences and their teachings, and that sometimes distorted them beyond recognition in the process of preservation. The mystic's direct experience becomes the priest's ritual. The prophet's vision becomes the institution's doctrine. The individual access to the transcendent becomes the organization that claims to manage access to the transcendent. And somewhere in the long translation from direct experience to institutional religion, the actual content of the original communication, the specific information about our origins and our makers and our purpose, gets replaced by metaphor, by symbol, by allegory that preserves the emotional resonance of the original without the factual content that made it what it was.
The second departure, when the last gods left, and why. There was a time in human memory, preserved in text and tradition, when the divine presence was still close, not as close as the first time, the mythological golden age when the gods walked openly among humans, but close enough to see, to hear, to encounter. And then, gradually, that presence withdrew further. The gap between the human and the divine widened. The encounters became rarer, less direct, more mediated by ritual and symbol. And then the encounters essentially ceased, and the age of religion, in the full modern sense, began. The age in which the divine presence is no longer directly accessible, but must be approached through faith and tradition, and the practices developed by those who, in the vanished past, had encountered it directly. The second departure, the final withdrawal of the remaining engineers and their hybrids from direct human contact, is recorded in the traditions of multiple cultures as a historical event, not a myth. The Egyptian tradition describes the end of the reign of the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, and the transition to fully human pharaonic rule. The Sumerian tradition describes the departure of the Anunnaki from Earth, their return to the heavens from which they had come. The Greek tradition describes the end of the age of heroes, the time when demigods like Heracles and Achilles walked the earth, and the beginning of the age of ordinary mortals. Why did they leave? The texts give multiple answers, not all of them consistent. Enlil's faction, the management faction, had always wanted less human-divine contact, not more, and may have successfully imposed the full withdrawal after the flood reset. The Watchers who had remained were, in this reading, eventually compelled to honor the non-interference protocol. Their withdrawal was not a choice, but an enforcement.
But there is another explanation, not incompatible with the first. The experiment had reached a stage where direct intervention was no longer appropriate. The purpose of the teachers and the guides and the divine kings was always to bring humanity to a point of self-sufficiency, to a point where civilization could sustain and develop itself without external support. If the engineers were good teachers, they would recognize when the students no longer needed them, when continued direct intervention would do more harm than good by preventing the development of the independence and self-reliance that humanity needed to fulfill its ultimate purpose. The Emerald Tablet, Hermes Trismegistus. What is above is like what is below. What is below is like what is above. The miracle of unity arises from this. All things were made from the One by contemplation of the One. Its father is the sun, its mother the moon. The wind carried it in its womb, the earth nursed it. Separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the coarse, gently and with great care. It ascends from earth to heaven, it descends again to earth, and receives the power of the higher and the lower. Thus you will have the glory of the whole world. The Emerald Tablet, the condensed transmission of Hermetic wisdom attributed to Thoth, has been interpreted alchemically, astronomically, psychologically, and spiritually for 2,000 years. But its most direct reading is cosmological. It describes a process of ascent and descent, of the divine descending into matter and matter ascending toward the divine as the fundamental dynamic of existence. Something came down, something is meant to go back up. The movement is cyclic: descent, transformation, ascent, return. In this framework, the engineers descended into matter by creating us. We are their descent, their material expression, their experiment in embodied consciousness. And the expected completion of the cycle, the ascent, is the eventual development of humanity to the point where we can, in some sense, return to the source. Not physically, perhaps, not literally in rocket ships or ancient vimanas, but in terms of consciousness, of understanding, of the capacity to apprehend the full truth of our own nature and origins. The capacity to look at the question, what are we and where do we come from, and actually answer it, not with myth and speculation, but with the clarity of beings who have grown into the knowledge that was placed in them as a seed. The departure of the gods was not abandonment. It was the withholding of assistance from a student who is now capable of walking on their own. It was the pulling back of the training wheels. And the silence that followed, the 2,000 years of dead gods and absent divinity that characterizes the modern religious situation, is not evidence that there was nothing there to begin with. It is the silence of someone who is watching from a distance to see if you can do it yourself. The evidence of continued watching. The watching has never entirely stopped. The reports of encounters with non-human beings of extraordinary capability, appearing in specific cultural and technological disguises appropriate to the era in which they occur, communicating specific information to specific individuals, then departing without leaving verifiable physical evidence, are too consistent across time and culture to dismiss entirely. The ancient encounters were with gods and angels and divine messengers. The medieval encounters were with miraculous apparitions, saints who flew, mystics who levitated and exhibited impossible knowledge. The modern encounters are with unidentified aerial phenomena and the beings associated with them. Encounters that the national security apparatus of multiple governments has been quietly investigating for decades, that pilots and military personnel and intelligence officials have reported with a specificity and consistency that resists easy dismissal, and that exhibit a technological profile that is either genuinely non-human or reflects a human technology so far beyond the public state-of-the-art that it amounts to the same thing. The watchers are still watching. The form has changed. The disguise appropriate to each age has been adopted, but the structural consistency, non-human beings of apparent superior capability, appearing and disappearing without explanation, occasionally communicating specific information to specific humans and then withdrawing, is the same across 5,000 years of recorded history. The engineers may have physically departed, but they have not entirely lost interest in what they made. What we carry inside. The genetic memory of the making. The answer to the question, who are we, is in the question itself. The capacity to ask the question,
The specific neurological architecture that generates not only the ability to communicate, but the compulsion to seek meaning, to construct models of origin and destiny, to feel the pain of uncertainty about our own nature, is the answer. We are the beings who ask. That is not an accident. That is the specification. Modern neuroscience has mapped with increasing precision the specific brain systems that generate the distinctively human experiences, the default mode network that produces the narrative self, the autobiographical memory systems that construct the continuous story of personal identity, the language networks that allow symbolic representation of abstract concepts, the theory of mind systems that model the mental states of others, and, most critically, that can turn that modeling capacity back on oneself and model one's own mental states. These systems, working together, produce what we call consciousness, the experience of being someone, somewhere in time. And these systems, all of them, appear to be the result of relatively recent evolutionary modifications that produced, in the anatomically modern human brain, a qualitative shift in the nature of experience that has no precise parallel in any other known species. The modifications are real, they are biological, they are encoded in the genome, and they are either the result of random mutation selected for by natural processes or the result of deliberate engineering. The probability calculation for the first option is not encouraging. The second option requires accepting the premise of this entire chronicle, but it makes the biology make sense in a way that the first does not. The junk that isn't junk. Approximately 98% of the human genome does not code for proteins, the functional molecules that carry out the cell's work. For decades, this non-coding DNA was dismissed as junk, the accumulated detritus of evolutionary history, ancient viral insertions, failed experiments, and broken genes that accumulated over millions of years and were never cleaned up because natural selection has no mechanism for removing DNA that is merely useless rather than actively harmful. We now know that this dismissal was premature. Much of the non-coding DNA is actively functional, not as protein-coding sequences, but as regulatory elements, controlling when and where and how much of the protein-coding genes are expressed. The non-coding genome is not the noise between the signal, it is the conductor of the orchestra, the system that determines which instruments play, when, and at what volume. And within the non-coding genome of humans, there are sequences that are uniquely human, sequences that have no homologue in our closest primate relatives, that appear to have been inserted or generated at or around the time of the anatomical and behavioral changes that define modern human biology. These human accelerated regions, HARs, are areas of the genome that evolved in the human lineage at a rate far faster than the background mutation rate would predict. They are not spread randomly across the genome. They cluster in regions associated with brain development. And the specific changes they encode are not random amino acid substitutions with unpredictable effects. They are precise, coordinated changes that together produce specific functional outcomes, changes in neural connectivity, changes in brain development timing, changes in the genetic regulation of cognitive capabilities. These human accelerated regions look, to someone willing to consider the possibility, less like random mutations that happen to be selected for, and more like specific engineering interventions, targeted changes to specific regulatory sequences precisely designed to produce specific outcomes in the developing human brain. They look, in other words, like the genetic fingerprints of the making, the specific marks left in our DNA by beings who knew exactly what they were doing when they made us. The answer to who made us may be in our own genome, written there by makers who knew that eventually we would learn to read it. The message encoded in our DNA, the question built into our consciousness, are the same. We are your makers. We are what you came from. Find your way back to us. The language center and the question factory. Broca's area and Wernicke's area, the two primary language processing regions of the human brain, are not merely the regions responsible for producing and comprehending speech. They are the regions responsible for the specific type of abstract, recursive, temporal language that is uniquely human, language that can speak about the past and the future as well as the present, that can embed clauses within clauses to represent complex logical relationships, that can represent abstract concepts, justice, infinity, love, God, that have no direct physical referent. These regions are dramatically larger and more complex in humans than in our closest primate relatives, and they develop in the growing human brain in a sequence that is timed with extraordinary precision to the development of other cognitive systems, particularly the systems for working memory and executive function. The development of the human language capacity is not a gradual process. It happens in discrete stages, each stage unlocking the next, in a sequence that reads more like the loading of a computer program than the random accumulation of biological modifications. At the center of this language capacity is what researchers call recursive syntax, the ability to embed grammatical structures within each other indefinitely, producing sentences of arbitrary complexity that can represent arbitrarily complex meanings. I know that you believe that she thinks that he will do what she hopes. Each level of embedding represents a distinct mental model of another mind's model of another mind. No other known species, even with extensive training, can do this. Chimpanzees can learn hundreds of words and combine them in simple sequences, but they cannot embed. They cannot represent the structure of another mind modeling a mind modeling a mind. They cannot ask, what does God think about what I think about why I exist? That question, the most distinctively human question, the one that drives all of philosophy and theology and science, is only possible because of the recursive language capacity. And the recursive language capacity is only possible because of the specific modifications to the human brain that distinguish us from every other species on Earth. The question factory is the gift. The ability to ask why we are here is itself the answer to why we are here. We were made to ask. And in the asking, in the long, driven, painful, beautiful, inexorable process of seeking answers to the question of our own origins, we are doing exactly what we were made to do. The return protocol, when we will meet our makers again. Every prophetic tradition on Earth, without exception, includes a vision of return, the end of a cycle, the close of an age, the coming of the kingdom, the end of days, the dawn of a new world, the return of the gods. These are not arbitrary fantasies of minds that cannot accept their own finitude. They are, if the story we have been assembling has any coherence, predictions, preserved across thousands of years of myth and prophecy of a specific event, the return of the engineers to assess what they made. The Maya tracked the end of the long count with a precision that implies knowledge of something specific about what the end of the long count would bring. The Hopi tradition of the fifth world arising from the ashes of the fourth. The Vedic Kali Yuga culminating in cosmic dissolution and renewal. The Zoroastrian final battle of Ahura Mazda against Ahriman. The Norse Ragnarok. The revelation of John. The Sufi concept of the final manifestation, the Lakota prophecy of the rainbow warriors. In every tradition, in every corner of the world, the same basic structure, a period of final corruption, chaos, and dissolution, followed by a cataclysmic transition, followed by a new beginning, in which the divine and the human are, once again, in direct relationship. These traditions do not all agree on the specifics. They do not all agree on timing, on the nature of the catastrophe, on what the new beginning looks like, but they agree on the essential structure. Something will happen. Something has been building toward. Something that will change the fundamental relationship between humanity and whatever it is that stands above and beyond ordinary human experience. Something will return. Something will be revealed. The long silence will end. The threshold moment. We are, by almost any measure, living through an extraordinary inflection point in human history. The pace of technological development is accelerating at a rate that is already producing cognitive and social challenges that our inherited psychological and institutional frameworks are not equipped to handle. We are, for the first time in human history, developing the ability to edit our own genome, to modify with intent the DNA that makes us what we are. We are developing artificial intelligence systems of rapidly increasing sophistication, systems that are beginning to exhibit capabilities that their creators do not fully understand and that resist easy categorization as merely computational. We are detecting with increasing frequency and credibility phenomena in the airspace and near space of Earth that do not conform to known human technological capabilities and that the governments of multiple nations are now officially acknowledging require investigation and explanation. And we are, for the first time in human history, at the point of actually reading our own genome with sufficient sophistication to begin detecting the specific features that the story we have been telling predicts we should find. The human accelerated regions, the inserted sequences, the regulatory elements that distinguish the human genome from our primate relatives in ways that natural selection alone do not convincingly explain. We are, in other words, at the threshold of actually finding the evidence of the making, not in mythology, not in stone monuments, but in the most intimate possible place, in the genetic code that is every human being's birthright. The Vedas, Vishnu Purana, age cycles. When the practices taught in the Vedas and institutes of law have nearly ceased, when the close of the Kali age shall be nigh, a portion of that divine being who exists of his own spiritual nature shall descend on earth. He will be endowed with 8 superhuman faculties. By his irresistible might, he will destroy all the barbarians and thieves and all whose minds are devoted to iniquity. He will reestablish righteousness upon earth. The minds of those who live at the end of the Kali age shall be awakened and shall be as clear as crystal. The men who are thus changed shall be as the seeds of human beings and will give birth to a race who will follow the laws of the age of purity. The return in the Vedic tradition is not the return of a foreign invader, but the manifestation of a divine potential that has always been present in the human lineage. The portion of that divine being that the engineering inserted into our genome and that will, at the proper moment in the cycle, finally express itself fully. The return is internal as much as external. It is us waking up fully. It is the mist on the mirror finally clearing. It is the software finally loading completely. It is humanity finally becoming, in full expression, what we were designed to be. The test we are always passing or failing. But the return in every tradition is also a judgment. The assessment of the makers. Have they done what they were made to do? Have they grown toward the potential that was encoded in them? Have they chosen, in the long run of their history, the path of wisdom over the path of destruction?
Have they treated each other and the world that was given to them with the care and intelligence that their enhanced cognition enables, or have they squandered the gift? This is the question that the flood posed the first time. Have you gone wrong? And it may be the question that is posed again. Not necessarily through another deletion. The story suggests that the Enki faction, the pro-humanity faction, won that particular argument once and intends to win it again, but through a reckoning, a moment when the evidence is assessed, the trajectory is evaluated, and the decision is made about what comes next for this species that was made with such effort and hope and risk. What does the evidence show? As a species, we have developed extraordinary capabilities in exactly the domains the engineering was designed to enhance. We have built civilization. We have accumulated knowledge across generations until that knowledge becomes the foundation for more knowledge in an accelerating spiral. We have developed science, a systematic method for establishing reliable facts about the physical universe that is the most powerful tool ever developed by any known intelligence for understanding the nature of reality. We have created art of staggering beauty and depth. We have produced philosophy of genuine insight. We have, in our best moments, extended our circle of moral consideration to include beings who are not members of our immediate tribe, and occasionally, in our very best moments, to include all sentient beings, all life, the earth itself. And in our worst moments, we have been exactly what the deletion was designed to prevent: violent, destructive, wasteful of our gifts, willing to destroy our own children and our own future for short-term advantage, capable of the most extraordinary cruelty to each other and to every other species on the planet. We have built weapons capable of destroying civilization entirely. We have altered the atmosphere of our home planet through carelessness so profound it can only be called willful. We have permitted, repeatedly and knowingly, the preventable deaths of billions of our own people from poverty and disease and the violence of those who choose power over compassion. We are a mixed result, extraordinary and terrible by turns. Exactly the kind of result, in other words, that you would predict from an experiment in which vast potential was given to beings who were not yet fully ready to use it wisely, who were smart enough to build everything and not yet wise enough to choose what to build. The return protocol, if such a thing exists, may be conditional on our own choices. The prophecies do not describe an automatic salvation or an automatic destruction. They describe a threshold, a point at which humanity's own direction of travel will determine what kind of future becomes accessible. The makers will return when we are ready. The question is whether ready means ready to be saved from ourselves or ready to take the next step forward as independent beings who have grown into the full expression of what they were designed to be. And the distinction between those two futures is, at this moment in our history, not yet determined. The question that never dies, and what it means that you are still asking it. You are reading this. That is the beginning and the end of the argument. You are a being of biological matter, assembled from elements forged in stellar cores, organized by a code that carries in it the traces of interventions far older than memory, who is asking the oldest question any being has ever asked. Where do I come from? Why am I here? Who made me, and what did they intend? The fact that you are asking is itself an extraordinary fact about the universe. In all the billions of galaxies, in all the trillions of star systems, on all the countless worlds that orbit those stars, how many beings are asking this question right now? How many have ever asked it? How many are capable of asking it? The question requires a mind capable of self-reflection, capable of temporal extension into past and future, capable of abstract symbolic thought, capable of the specific kind of conscious self-awareness that makes it possible to turn the mind's attention back upon itself and ask, "What am I?"
You are one of approximately 8 billion such beings currently alive on a single small world in the outer arm of a spiral galaxy that is itself one of 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. 8 billion beings capable of asking the most profound question in all of existence. And every one of those 8 billion beings, from the physicist at CERN, to the child in a mud house in South Sudan, to the fisherman in the Pacific, to the soldier in a trench, to the grandmother telling stories to her grandchildren by firelight, every single one of them, at some moment in their conscious life, asks it, "Why am I here? What does any of this mean? Is there anyone out there who knows?" The universality of the question is the answer. Not the complete answer, not the satisfying final answer that closes the book. That answer may be beyond our current capacity to receive, but the beginning of the answer, the first line of the answer. We ask because we were made to ask. We were made to ask because the asking is the first step of the journey. And the journey, the long, painful, beautiful, inexorable human journey from the first modified hominid who looked up at the night sky and felt something that was not quite wonder and not quite fear, but something between the two. The journey is the point. The synthesis. Let us gather what we have assembled and see if it holds together as a coherent story. Not a provable story, not yet, perhaps not for a long time, but a coherent one. A story that takes seriously the evidence from multiple disciplines and asks, what does it look like if we don't assume in advance that the answer must be purely naturalistic? The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. Life on Earth began approximately 3.8 billion years ago, perhaps assisted by directed panspermia from a civilization that existed before our solar system formed. The great filters, the Cambrian explosion, the mass extinctions, the rise of complex multicellular life were navigated by a lineage whose trajectory was, at critical moments, influenced by beings with knowledge of biology far beyond our own. 6 million years ago, the hominid lineage diverged from the chimpanzee lineage under conditions that remain imperfectly explained by natural selection alone. Over the following millions of years, the primate brain developed in ways that made the engineering easier to implement when the time came. Somewhere between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago, the timeline is uncertain, the final engineering modification was made to a population of Homo sapiens or their immediate ancestors. This modification, delivered through a biological vector of some kind, introduced specific genetic sequences into the human germline that produced, over the generations that followed, the specific cluster of cognitive capabilities that defines anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. Recursive language, full self-awareness, abstract symbolic thought, the default mode network, the capacity for transcendent experience. The universe made stars so that the stars could make matter. Matter organized itself into life so that life could develop minds. Minds were shaped to ask questions. The questions were placed in them by those who already knew the answers and who are waiting to see if their creation can find the way back. The first fully modern humans lived in close contact with their makers, a period preserved in mythology as the Golden Age, the Garden of Eden, the first time. Over thousands of years, as the human population grew and spread, direct contact became less common and more mediated. A group of engineers, the Watchers, chose to remain in close contact with humanity against the protocol of their own faction, producing human-engineer hybrids, the Nephilim, and transmitting technological and spiritual knowledge to human communities. This unauthorized contact produced a cultural explosion in the early human population, but also alarmed the management faction, which responded with the flood event,
a deliberate mass die-off designed to reset the human population to a more controlled baseline. The survivors of the reset, the Noah figures and the 7 sages of various traditions, preserved as much of the pre-flood knowledge as they could and transmitted it to the post-flood civilizations that were rebuilt under their guidance. The Neolithic Revolution, the simultaneous development of agriculture, monumental architecture, and complex social organization across multiple locations, reflects the post-flood reconstruction guided by the surviving teachers and the hybrid beings who served as their proxies. The great stone monuments of the ancient world are, among other things, encoded messages to future civilizations, messages that preserve astronomical, geodetic, and cosmological knowledge that the builders knew might otherwise be lost in the long silence that would follow their departure. The engineers finally withdrew completely at some point in the 2nd or 3rd millennium BCE, the period of transition from the divine king systems of the Bronze Age to the more fully human-run civilizations of the Iron Age. Since then, they have maintained a watching presence, recorded in various forms across the centuries, but have not intervened directly. Their absence has driven the entire development of human religion, philosophy, and science, the long-driven attempt to understand where we came from and what we are meant to become, in the absence of the voices that once told us directly. We are now approaching a threshold. The capabilities we are developing, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, space travel, the reading of the genome, are converging on the point where the story of our making will become legible to us from our own resources. We will find the evidence in our DNA. We will develop the cognitive and technological tools to interpret the stone monuments fully. We will, if the trajectory continues, encounter the watching presence in a form that can no longer be dismissed. And we will face, fully and without the comfort of ignorance, the question that our making built into us. What are we? Who made us? And what are we supposed to do with what we were given? The synthesis. Let us gather what we have assembled and see if it holds together as a coherent story. Not a provable story, not yet, perhaps not for a long time, but a coherent one. A story that takes seriously the evidence from multiple disciplines and asks, what does it look like if we don't assume in advance that the answer must be purely naturalistic? The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. Life on Earth began approximately 3.8 billion years ago, perhaps assisted by directed panspermia from a civilization that existed before our solar system formed. The great filters, the Cambrian explosion, the mass extinctions, the rise of complex multicellular life were navigated by a lineage whose trajectory was, at critical moments, influenced by beings with knowledge of biology far beyond our own. 6 million years ago, the hominid lineage diverged from the chimpanzee lineage under conditions that remain imperfectly explained by natural selection alone. Over the following millions of years, the primate brain developed in ways that made the engineering easier to implement when the time came. Somewhere between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago, the timeline is uncertain, the final engineering modification was made to a population of Homo sapiens or their immediate ancestors. This modification, delivered through a biological vector of some kind, introduced specific genetic sequences into the human germline that produced, over the generations that followed, the specific cluster of cognitive capabilities that defines anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. Recursive language, full self-awareness, abstract symbolic thought, the default mode network, the capacity for transcendent experience. The universe made stars so that the stars could make matter. Matter organized itself into life so that life could develop minds. Minds were shaped to ask questions. The questions were placed in them by those who already knew the answers and who are waiting to see if their creation can find the way back. The first fully modern humans lived in close contact with their makers, a period preserved in mythology as the Golden Age, the Garden of Eden, the first time. Over thousands of years, as the human population grew and spread, direct contact became less common and more mediated. A group of engineers, the Watchers, chose to remain in close contact with humanity against the protocol of their own faction, producing human-engineer hybrids, the Nephilim, and transmitting technological and spiritual knowledge to human communities. This unauthorized contact produced a cultural explosion in the early human population, but also alarmed the management faction, which responded with the flood event, a deliberate mass die-off designed to reset the human population to a more controlled baseline. The survivors of the reset, the Noah figures and the 7 sages of various traditions, preserved as much of the pre-flood knowledge as they could and transmitted it to the post-flood civilizations that were rebuilt under their guidance. The Neolithic Revolution, the simultaneous development of agriculture, monumental architecture, and complex social organization across multiple locations, reflects the post-flood reconstruction guided by the surviving teachers and the hybrid beings who served as their proxies. The great stone monuments of the ancient world are, among other things, encoded messages to future civilizations, messages that preserve astronomical, geodetic, and cosmological knowledge that the builders knew might otherwise be lost in the long silence that would follow their departure. The engineers finally withdrew completely at some point in the 2nd or 3rd millennium BCE, the period of transition from the divine king systems of the Bronze Age to the more fully human-run civilizations of the Iron Age. Since then, they have maintained a watching presence, recorded in various forms across the centuries, but have not intervened directly. Their absence has driven the entire development of human religion, philosophy, and science, the long-driven attempt to understand where we came from and what we are meant to become, in the absence of the voices that once told us directly. We are now approaching a threshold. The capabilities we are developing, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, space travel, the reading of the genome, are converging on the point where the story of our making will become legible to us from our own resources. We will find the evidence in our DNA. We will develop the cognitive and technological tools to interpret the stone monuments fully. We will, if the trajectory continues, encounter the watching presence in a form that can no longer be dismissed. And we will face, fully and without the comfort of ignorance, the question that our making built into us. What are we? Who made us? And what are we supposed to do with what we were given? The final mystery. But here is what every strand of this story, however it is told, however it is interpreted, converges on as its final and deepest point. The engineers made us. The engineers were themselves made by something, by the same universe, the same process of evolution, the same long climb from simple to complex, from matter to mind, from mind to whatever it is that contemplates the whole. The engineers did not create existence, they were created by it, as we were created by them. And the universe itself, the 13.8 billion-year-old conversation between matter and energy that produced, among its uncountable outcomes, both the engineers and us, was either the product of a still greater intelligence, or it was not. The question of ultimate origins, the question of what, if anything, preceded the universe, what breathed out the first breath, what thought the first thought of which the entire cosmos is the expression, is the question that all others reduce to. and it is the question to which no answer has yet been found, and perhaps to which no answer can be found by the means available to us in our current state of development, with our mist-veiled mirrors and our beautifully limited minds. Perhaps that is the final point. Perhaps the reason we were made to ask the question is not that the answer is available to us in our current form. Perhaps the making was the beginning of a journey that we are still in the early stages of, a journey toward a form of understanding that requires not just more data, but more being, a deeper, fuller, more complete expression of the potential that was encoded in us. Perhaps the mist on the mirror was not a permanent limitation, but a temporary one, a developmental stage, appropriate to a young species that needed to grow before it could handle the full light of what it truly is. And perhaps the clearing of the mist, the full waking, the full becoming, is what the return of the makers will mean. Not that they come back to rule us again, as master returns to servant, but that they come back to witness something, to witness the completion of the experiment, the expression of the full potential of what they placed in that first handful of modified clay so many hundreds of thousands of years ago, to see what became of the fire they stole from heaven and gave to us, to see if, in the long run of our history, we learned to carry it without burning everything down, to see if the clay, given enough time and enough of their own ancient fire, could become something that no longer needed the potter, could shape itself, could ask the question and find the answer, and look back at its makers as equals, as siblings in the long story of consciousness trying to understand itself in an inconceivably vast and ancient universe. They made us to surpass them. That is the final mystery and the final gift. They made us not as servants, but as successors, beings who would carry the flame of consciousness further than they had carried it, who would ask questions they had not thought to ask, who would discover truths that their ancient, brilliant, limited minds could not access. The experiment was never about producing something useful. It was about producing something that would grow beyond them. It was about passing the torch. We are the torch. We are burning. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, the ones who lit us are watching, waiting to see how far we will go.
Final inscription, Providence unknown. We will not tell you everything. You were not made to be told everything. You were made to discover. You were made to remember. You were made to ask the question that has no small answer, and to be unsatisfied with all small answers, and in that dissatisfaction to keep searching, keep reaching, keep burning toward the light that is your own deepest nature, staring back at you from the face of the cosmos you were made to inhabit. We are not gone. We never left. We are in the question you can't stop asking. We are in the yearning that nothing temporal satisfies. We are in the beauty that breaks your heart because it is too much like home. We are in the gene that makes you different from every other animal that has ever walked this world. We are in the fire. Find your way back. We will be here.